200 candles of beeswax burned without a single flicker in the nave of St. George's, Hanover Square, on the 9th of June, 1825, when Sebastian Fanshawe, 6th Earl of Ashcombe, bent his head and said the first thing he had truly meant for her since the morning their betrothal was announced in the Morning Post. He did not say it before the altar, where the whole of fashionable London sat watching. He said it beneath the edge of her veil, where only she could hear it. "You think I don't know who you're waiting for." Marianne Selwyn did not turn her head. She did not tighten her grip on the bouquet of white roses and stephanotis that had cost more than a Norfolk laborer earned in a 12-month. She only lifted her chin by the small possible degree and answered him in the same low, level register he had used. "Then you had better tell me who." He said nothing more. The Bishop of London was turning a page of his prayer book. 300 guests in silk and superfine were watching what 3 newspapers had already agreed, before the event itself had even taken place, to call the most sensible match of the season. The church itself had been chosen for its situation rather than its intimacy. St. George's stood at the very heart of Mayfair, convenient to every great house in the parish, and its portico had seen more advantageous marriages solemnized beneath it in the past 20 years than any other church in London. The organ had been playing since 10:30. Hothouse roses, forced into bloom a full month before their season, stood in tall arrangements along the aisle at a cost Marianne did not care to calculate. And somewhere above the chancel a choir of boys was singing an anthem about everlasting love with the unconcerned sweetness of children who have not yet understood what the words mean. Marianne wore her own mother's veil, mended twice at the hem by her own hand the week before, because there had been no money in the Selwyn household for new Brussels lace, and because she had wanted, whatever else was true of this marriage, to wear something into it that had belonged to a woman she still missed more than she allowed herself to feel on ordinary days. She had counted, from behind that veil, no fewer than 4 newspapermen among the crowd outside the church doors when her carriage arrived, sketching the scene for the illustrated papers that would run some approximation of her likeness beneath a caption calling her fortunate. She did not feel fortunate. She felt, standing at the head of the aisle, with her father's arm trembling almost imperceptibly beneath her gloved hand, like a woman about to sign her name to a document she had not been permitted to read in full. None of the 300 guests saw what the Earl of Ashcombe saw in that moment, that the gray eyes beneath the Brussels lace were the color of the North Sea in November, and that they held not one flicker of the fear he had been certain, with the flat, unexamined certainty of a man who had never once been proven wrong about a woman he would find there. She glanced once toward the small door behind the north aisle. It was the door her brother should have come through before the bells began, carrying whatever it was he had written 3 weeks ago to say he had found. "I have it now," Theo's letter had said. "I will be there before you say a word you cannot unsay. Wait for me, Marianne, if you can." The door did not open, she had decided, in the carriage on the way from Grosvenor Square, that if she looked at that door and let herself hope, she would not be able to stop hoping, and if she could not stop, she would not be able to speak her vows at all. So she turned back to the altar, and she spoke them in a voice that did not catch once, and the ring a wide gold band, unfashionably plain for a man of his consequence, slid onto her finger as though it had been cut for it. They turned to face the congregation. Marianne did not look at the door again. 3 rows behind the transept, in a pew that had been reserved for family and had not entirely been filled, a man in a dark green coat sat watching her rather than watching the bride and groom together, wearing the look of someone who has just understood he has misjudged a hand of cards he believed he already held. His name was Josiah Fanshawe, and he was the bridegroom's uncle, and he was smiling in the way a man smiles when a debt has finally, after 10 years, come due. In the crush of the vestry, while the register was signed and witnessed and the choir began an anthem no one below the age of 40 seemed able to follow, Marianne found herself for a moment alone with her father. The two of them pressed into the narrow space between the vestry door and a monument to a bishop 3 centuries dead. Sir Edmund Selwyn took her gloved hand in both of his own, which had grown, these last few years, thin enough that she could feel the shape of every bone in them. "You did that very well," he said. There was no reproach in it, only a kind of exhausted wonder, as though he had watched a much younger version of himself do something he had never managed. "Better than I could have. There was nothing to do, Papa, only to say the words." There is always something to do when a Selwyn is asked to stand still and be looked at. He said it lightly, the way he said most things now, as though 10 years of practice had worn the edges off a grief he had never once described to her in full. "Your mother would have told you the same, had she lived to see it." Marianne did not trust herself to answer that. She had inherited a great many things from her mother: the pale hair, the habit of composing her face before she composed her thoughts, a certain patience with silence that other women found unnerving, but she had never learned, and had stopped hoping she would learn, how to speak of either of her parents without the whole of the last decade collapsing into the space of a single breath. Her father's ruin, her mother's death only 3 years past, and everything in between that no one in the family had ever agreed to discuss above a whisper. "Theo will come," she said instead, because it was the only comfort she had left to offer either of them. "He'll come, and it will all be put right." Her father's hand tightened briefly on hers, and for the first time since she had entered the church that morning, something moved behind his composed, papery face that was not composure at all. "Whatever he brings you, Marianne," he said, very low, so that even the bishop's monument might not have heard it, "you are not to do anything reckless with it. Do you understand me? I have already lost enough. I could not bear to lose you to it as well." She promised him nothing, because it was not a promise she intended to keep, and he seemed, in the way of a man who has known his daughter for 22 years, to understand that as clearly as if she had said it aloud. Sebastian did not know, walking his wife down the nave with her gloved hand resting on his sleeve, why he had said what he had said at the altar. It was not the sort of thing he did. He had built a reputation in the Commons, before his father's death moved him to the Lords, on the strength of never once saying more than an occasion required. But something about the composed, unhurried way she had walked the length of the aisle toward him, without a single glance at her own father seated in the second pew, had made him want to see whether the composure could be cracked. It had not cracked. If anything, it had hardened. He had met her exactly 3 times before this morning, each time under the supervision of her father and his own solicitor, in rooms built for the transaction of business rather than the formation of attachments. He had found her civil, quiet, and entirely unremarkable, which was precisely what he had wanted from a wife acquired to settle, once and for all, the tiresome matter of the Selwyn land along the clay shore, 300 acres of salt marsh and grazing that abutted his own, and that his uncle had spent the better part of a year explaining, with maps and tide tables, and as patient Sebastian found faintly suspicious, the estate could not properly manage without. The marriage had been proposed the previous October, over a dinner at which Josiah had done most of the talking. Sir Edmund Selwyn's name, Josiah had said, still carried enough of the old stain that no man of consequence would take the daughter without some compensating advantage. The Ashcombe title was compensating advantage enough for anyone, and the coastal acreage would come to the family without the expense and delay of a purchase. It had seemed, at the time, a reasonable proposal for a man who had inherited a title, a debt-encumbered estate, and an uncle's decade of careful management, and very little inclination to arrange his own future by any more romantic method. It had seemed reasonable until this morning, when he had looked at her properly, for the first time not across a negotiating table, but across 6 inches of Brussels lace, and found a woman who did not appear to know she had been acquired at all. Ashcombe House, in Mount Street, had been dressed for the wedding breakfast with a thoroughness that spoke of his uncle's hand more than his own. Portraits of dead Fanshaws, famous variously for their loyalty to the crown and their talent for improving a rent roll, looked down from the long gallery upon 400 guests, the 300 who had filled the church, together with 100 more who had not troubled themselves with the ceremony, but would not for the world have missed the breakfast, who had come to eat cold fowl and drink champagne and agree with one another, in low and satisfied voices, that the new Countess of Ashcombe was a handsome, well-mannered, entirely suitable addition to a family that had, everyone privately agreed, rather needed the addition of some fresh capital. Marianne sat at her husband's right hand and ate 3 mouthfuls of pheasant, and accepted congratulations from strangers with the same exact smile she had worn at the altar. She did not look at the door, through which a footman might, at any moment, bring word of her brother. She had decided that, too, somewhere between the church and the house, along with the decision about the carriage, if she looked, she would not stop looking. And a woman who could not stop looking at a door was a woman the whole room would begin to watch instead of politely ignoring. Theo had not come. Theo, who had written to say he had the proof at last and would reach her before the ceremony. Theo, who was somewhere between Norfolk and London, or somewhere worse, and whose absence sat in her chest like a second heartbeat, slower and colder than her own. Josiah found Sebastian near the tall windows at the end of the gallery, where the afternoon light fell across the last of the wedding gifts, laid out for the guests to admire: a canteen of silver, a set of Sevres, a check from Lord Denbrook that Sebastian had not yet had occasion to examine. "You did well," Josiah said, in the tone of a man congratulating himself. "I confess I did not think you would manage the church without incident." Selwyn women are said to have a temper under all that composure. She was perfectly composed, so I saw. Better than composed, she looked as though she'd been rehearsing it since she was 12. Josiah's eyes moved across the room to where Marianne stood beside her father, a thin, graying man who held his wine-glass as though it might be taken from him at any moment. "Well, the land is as good as settled now. I'll want the surveyors out to Clay. Before Michaelmas, there's drainage work wanted on the northern boundary that should have been seen to these 10 years, and now there's no reason to delay it. There's a wedding breakfast happening around you, Uncle." "There is a great deal of money happening around me," Josiah said, not quite smiling, "which is a thing I have learned to attend to whenever it presents itself, whether or not there is champagne in the room at the time." He clapped Sebastian once on the shoulder, a gesture that had always struck Sebastian as belonging to a man 20 years his uncle's junior, and moved off toward the card-room, where 3 gentlemen of his acquaintance from the city had already retired to discuss, Sebastian did not doubt, something considerably more pressing to Josiah than the marriage he had just witnessed. A folded copy of that morning's Times sat discarded on a side table near the card-room door, and Sebastian, passing it on his way to find Denbrook, noticed without particularly attending to it a paragraph on the second page, reporting that shares in two of the new foreign mining concerns ventures got up the previous year to work silver and gold in the Mexican provinces. All the rage among speculative gentlemen since the Spanish colonies had thrown off their king had fallen sharply again that week on thin trading. It meant nothing to him. He had no money in mines, foreign or otherwise, and gave the paragraph no more thought than he gave the shipping notices beside it, folded the paper closed, and went to find his patron, and did not think of it again for the better part of half a year. And Sebastian watched his uncle go and felt, not for the first time that year, the small persistent unease of a man who suspects he does not know the whole of his own affairs. His uncle had managed the estate's finances since his father's death 3 years before a sensible arrangement at the time. Given the debts his father had left and the 10-year trust his will had established to see them cleared before the Ashcombe fortune passed entirely into his son's hands, Sebastian had never had cause to question it. He questioned very little that his uncle told him, which he understood. In the vague way one understands a fact one has not examined closely enough to be troubled by, was rather the point of the arrangement. He had been at Cambridge in the year his father was said to have first crossed swords with Sir Edmund Selwyn over some matter of drainage rights along the clay shore, a dispute Sebastian had absorbed, over the years, only as a kind of family weather, a long-standing coolness between two houses that had never fully been explained to him, and that he had never troubled to ask about, in the way a young man rarely troubles to ask why his father dislikes a particular neighbor when there are horses to ride and examinations to avoid. His father had died 3 years before, quite suddenly, in the last week of a wet February, and had left behind a will, a debt, and an uncle appointed to manage both, and very little else in the way of explanation for any of it. Sebastian had grieved him properly, he believed. In the ordinary fashion, a son grieves a father he had respected without ever having been permitted to know especially well. It had not occurred to him until this week, watching his uncle move through his own wedding breakfast with the easy proprietary confidence of a man attending to business rather than celebration, to wonder whether there was anything about his father's last years he had simply never been shown. Across the gallery, his uncle detached himself from the cardroom men long enough to bow over Marianne's hand and say something that made her go very still, not frightened, precisely, but attentive the way a woman listens for what is not being said as much as for what is. Sebastian was too far off to hear the words. He saw only that Josiah smiled through the whole of it, and that Marianne's own smile did not once slip, and that when his uncle straightened and moved away again, she looked, for just a moment, toward the window rather than toward anyone in the room, as though there were something to see in a pane of London glass besides her own reflection. He meant to ask her about it later. He did, in the end, get the chance. There were too many hands to shake, too many toasts to receive with the correct measure of gravity and pleasure combined, and by the time the last of the guests had gone, and the candles in the long gallery had burned down to stubs among the dead Fanshaw's painted stairs, he had forgotten the moment entirely, in the way a man forgets a great many small, true things in the course of a single very long day. Lord Denbrook found him a quarter of an hour later, a glass of Madeira in one hand, and the look of a man who has spent the morning calculating exactly how a piece of good news might be made to serve two purposes at once. A fine match, Ashcombe. Fine match. Denbrook was 61, silver-haired, and had sat in the Lords since before Sebastian was born. He had also, in the 3 years since Sebastian's father's death, taken on the office of something between a patron and a second father, an arrangement Sebastian had accepted gratefully, and had not, until this morning, examined too closely either. I had a letter from Norwich yesterday. The Duke is disposed to support you for the lieutenancy when old Ferrars finally goes, and he will go, my boy. The man has been dying by inches since Christmas. A married man, settled, land on both sides of the county, consolidated under one name. It reads very well. Ashcombe. Very well indeed. I hadn't thought so far ahead, Sebastian said, which was not entirely true. No need to. I've thought far enough ahead for both of us. Denbrook's gaze drifted, as everyone's had all afternoon, toward Marianne. She'll do very well at it, I should think. Quiet women make the best hostesses for a lieutenant's table, all that entertaining, and none of the opinions to manage alongside it. There is also the matter of Almack's, Denbrook went on, lowering his voice as though the patronesses themselves might be listening from behind the nearest portrait. Lady Jersey asked after your countess, most particularly at the Cowper's rout last week, wanted to know would she be presented before this season closes, or left to wait for next year. I told her before, naturally. A new countess who isn't seen at Almack's within her first month might as well not exist, as far as this town is concerned, and we cannot have anyone thinking there's some reason she oughtn't be seen. Is there some reason she oughtn't be seen? Not that I know of, Denbrook said, with the faint, unbothered laugh of a man who had never once had to consider the question seriously. Her father's business was a long time ago, and men have shorter memories than they like to pretend, provided the woman in question has a title good enough to help them forget. He said this, Sebastian understood, as a compliment. He understood also, with a discomfort he could not yet put a name to, that he had no idea whether it was true. They left for Ashcombe Park 3 days later, in a traveling coach that had carried 2 previous countesses of Ashcombe to the same house and smelled, faintly and permanently, of lavender water and old leather. Sebastian had business that would keep him in London through the autumn, the trust accounts to review with his uncle, and the delicate, ongoing work of persuading 3 separate men of property that supporting his candidacy for the lieutenancies was in their own interest as much as his. Marianne was to go ahead to Norfolk, learn the house, and wait to be sent for. He told her this at the door of the carriage, in the same even voice he had used at the altar. You'll find the staff capable. Mrs. Pargeter has had a long letter of instruction from my uncle, so you needn't trouble yourself with the running of things until you've had time to settle. Of course, my uncle will visit before Michaelmas to see to the drainage survey on the clay boundary. You'll extend him whatever courtesy the house requires. Of course. He looked at her then, the way he had looked at her at the altar, the small, troubled attention of a man examining a piece of evidence he could not quite classify. You agree to a great deal, madam. I agree to everything that costs me nothing, she said, and stepped up into the carriage without waiting for his hand. He stood on the gravel a moment longer than the departure required. Then he closed the door himself and stepped back, and the coach pulled away down Mount Street with a woman inside it he had been married to for 3 days and did not yet know at all. The journey north took the better part of 2 days, with a night's stop at an inn in Newmarket where Marianne slept badly and dreamed, not of her husband, but of the door behind the north aisle, opening at last onto nothing at all. She spent the hours on the road with a book she did not read and a window she watched instead, marking the country change by degrees from the ordered hedgerows of Cambridgeshire into the flatter, wider light of Norfolk, where the sky seemed to take up rather more than its fair share of the view, and the church towers stood up out of the fields like the masts of ships run aground, she thought, somewhere past Thetford, of her mother, who had made this same journey in reverse 22 years before, coming south as a young bride to a house in Norfolk she had never seen, and who had written to her own mother in a letter Marianne had found among Lady Selwyn's things after her death, that she had decided before she ever crossed the threshold that she would love whatever she found inside it, because a woman who waited to be given reasons to love her circumstances generally waited a very long time. Marianne was not at all sure she meant to follow that example. She meant, instead, to know exactly what she had married into before she decided anything about it at all. Ashcombe Park stood some 30 miles north of Norwich and 4 from the sea, a square, pale house of soft gray stone set against a stand of beech that a Fanshawe had planted 130 years before, family legend held, expressly to discourage the neighbors from seeing in. Marianne stepped down into the forecourt in the last light of a June evening and drew off her gloves with the deliberate care of a woman who intended to stay, whatever else about the day had been decided without her. She had brought very little with her. From Salthouse, 2 trunks of gowns made over from her mother's, a small case of books, and a rosewood workbox that had been Lady Selwyn's, its lock broken since before Marianne could remember, and never repaired, because her father could never quite bring himself to have it seen to by a stranger's hands. Everything else in her new rooms belonged, in one sense or another, to the Fanshawe family. The bed hangings, the dressing table, the very key to the door. She arranged her few things around room's edges that first night, the way a guest arranges belongings in a room she does not expect to be asked to stay in for long, and told herself this was only a matter of time and unfamiliarity, and did not entirely believe it. Mrs. Pargeter met her in the hall, a tall, spare woman of perhaps 50, with the stillness of a servant who has run a household long enough to have opinions about everyone in it, and the good sense to keep most of them to herself. "Welcome to Ashcombe Park, my lady. His lordship's uncle sent word you'd want the blue room made up rather than the countess's rooms, until you'd had time to choose your own arrangement of the furniture." "That was thoughtful of him," Marianne said, and filed the thoughtfulness away, without quite knowing why. In the same place she kept everything else she had not yet decided what to make of. Within her first week at Ashcombe Park, Marianne asked Mrs. Pargeter to walk the house with her from the cellars to the leads, and the housekeeper obliged with the brisk, faintly proud manner of a woman who had been waiting years for a mistress interested enough to ask. The house, she learned, had been built by the 2nd Earl in the reign of Queen Anne, on the ruins of an older manor said to have been burned during the wars of the previous century, though Marianne privately suspected this last detail owed rather more to family legend than to any surviving record. The long gallery held portraits back to a Fanshawe who had fought at Naseby. The chapel, disused since the last countess's time, still held a set of prayer books with the family arms stamped in gilt on every cover. Mrs. Pargeter knew the name of every servant who had ever died in the house and the year of every roof repair since 1780, and by the end of the tour Marianne understood 2 things clearly: that the house had been loved, thoroughly and for generations, by people who were not the man she had married, and that she had married into a history she knew almost nothing about, beyond the 10 years of it that had ruined her own family. She learned the names of 11 servants and the temperaments of 4 dogs in that same week, and began, in the unhurried way of a woman with a great deal of time and a very particular purpose, to ask about keys. "The muniment room, my lady?" Mrs. Pargeter's face did not change, which was itself a kind of answer. "His lordship's papers aren't customarily disturbed. Mr. Fanshawe, his lordship's uncle, keeps the 2nd key himself, in London. I have no intention of disturbing anything. I should like to read what's there. A countess ought to know something of the estate she's mistress of. Don't you think, Mrs. Pargeter?" It was she knew even as she said it, The kind of sentence that could not easily be refused without refusing the principle behind it, and Mrs. Pargeter, who had clearly weighed a London instruction against a Norfolk-born instinct and decided, after a pause just long enough to be noticed, that the mistress standing in front of her was the nearer authority, produced the first key the following morning. The second she did not have. That one, it seemed, would have to be found another way, and Marianne, sealing the thought away with the others, the door that had not opened, the letter that had not come, decided she had time enough to find it. The letter from Theo reached her 11 days after the wedding, brought up from the village post by a footman, who noted afterward to Mrs. Pargeter that her ladyship's face had gone the color of the paper itself, though she had not made a sound. He was alive. He had been delayed, set upon, on the road 2 miles outside a village she had never heard of, by men who had wanted, it seemed, only what he carried and not his life. Though they had come near enough to taking it that he had lain 3 days in a farmhouse before he could write to her at all. He was recovering slowly at their aunt's house in Hertfordshire. He said nothing of what had been in the satchel, only that it was gone, and that he was sorry, and that he would explain everything the moment he could hold a pen without his hand shaking. She thought, reading it, of Theo at 9 years old, teaching himself to swim in the shallows below Salthouse because their father could no longer afford to keep a boat, and Theo had decided the sea belonged to anyone determined enough to get into it without one. She thought of him at 16, the year their mother died, standing very straight through the whole of the funeral and then weeping for a solid hour afterward in the stable, where he had believed no one could hear him, and where Marianne had sat outside the door the entire time rather than intrude on the one place he had ever allowed himself to fall apart. He had grown, in the 3 years since, into a young man who took after their mother far more than their father, quick, stubborn, incapable of leaving an injustice alone once he had noticed it, which was, Marianne suspected, exactly the quality that had put him in a ditch 2 miles outside a village she had never heard of, carrying papers someone had very much wanted him not to carry. Marianne read the letter, standing at the window of the small sitting room that looked east toward the sea. She could not see, but could smell on certain evenings when the wind came off the marsh. She read it twice. Then she folded it once, and once again, and carried it upstairs to the writing desk that had belonged, Mrs. Pargeter told her, to the last countess but one, and took out a fresh sheet of paper and began, in a hand that did not shake at all, to write to a solicitor in Norwich whose name she had found 3 days before, on the back of an old letter in her father's desk at Salthouse Hall, a name that meant nothing to her yet, except that her mother had trusted him once, and her mother had trusted almost no one. When the letter to Mr. Coombs was sealed, she did not ring for a servant to carry it. She put on her cloak and walked the mile to the village post herself, in the last of the daylight, past hedgerows heavy with the year's first elderflower, while the tide turned somewhere beyond the marsh she still could not see. That night, before she undressed for bed, she opened the drawer of the writing desk that had belonged to the countess before her, and found, tucked beneath a stack of unused visiting cards, a small marbled notebook with perhaps a dozen pages used, and the rest left blank, a commonplace book some previous mistress of the house had begun and abandoned. She sat with it a long while before she wrote anything at all. Then, in the same steady hand she had used for the letter to Mr. Coombs, she set down the thing she had been carrying since the nave of St. George's like a second, colder heartbeat of her own. I will not beg, not for the truth, and not for anything it costs me to get it. Whatever's in that room, whatever Theo was carrying, whatever it costs this house to give it back to me, I will ask for it once plainly, and if I am refused, I will find another way. I will not ask twice." She blotted the page, closed the book, and locked it into the drawer with the small brass key that had come with the desk, the one key in the house. She realized as she turned it that belonged to her and to no one else at all. She had said the same thing once already, aloud, to a man who had expected it to frighten her. Writing it down, she found, frightened her rather more. It was one thing to refuse to beg a stranger for kindness. It was quite another to promise, in ink, in a book with her own name nowhere in it, that she would not beg her own husband, either not for his trust, not for his help, and not, if it ever came to that, for his love. The summer had turned, by slow and scarcely noticed degrees, into a Norfolk autumn of the kind Mary Ann had known all her life, and had somehow never learned to love mist rising off the marsh most mornings until well past 9. The light going thin and slanted earlier each week. The beech wood beyond the house turning, in the space of a fortnight, from green to a deep, burnished gold that Sebastian's absent letters, arriving twice weekly from London, with news of trust accounts and parliamentary business, never once thought to remark upon. She had settled, by August's end, into a rhythm of her own devising. Mornings for the estate's ordinary business, afternoons, when the light and her own nerve both held, for the muniment room, and evenings for letters to Theo, recovering slowly in Hertfordshire, and to no one else. Because there was no one else, yet she trusted, with what her mornings and afternoons had begun, piece by careful piece, to reveal. In the last week of August, before she had yet found a way to the second key, Mary Ann rode out from Ashcombe Park along the coast lane toward Clay, partly for the exercise and partly, she admitted to herself only reluctantly, because she wanted to see for herself the drainage her husband's uncle had been so urgent about since the wedding breakfast. She found the northern boundary easily enough, marked by a stretch of sea-wall considerably lower and more crumbled than the maps in the estate office had led her to expect, and an old man mending a fence nearby, who straightened at her approach and touched his hat with the caution of a tenant unused to being addressed directly by anyone above the rank of steward. "That wall's wanted mending since before my boy was born, my lady, and he's 22 this Michaelmas," the man said, when she asked, in answer to a question that had cost her rather more courage to put plainly than she expected a simple question about a wall to require. "We petitioned the old Earl about it." "Oh, 3 or 4 times over the years, my father before me petitioned him too." Come to that, and always the answer came back the same, that the funds were spoken for elsewhere, and the repair would come in its season. Season never seemed to come. "If you'll forgive my saying so, my lady, not in 30 years of asking. Do you know why the funds were spoken for elsewhere?" The old man looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read, not suspicion, exactly, but the wary blankness of a man who has learned, over a long life in a small parish, precisely which questions were safe to answer honestly and which were not. "That's not for the likes of me to say, my lady," he said at last, and touched his hat again, and went back to his fence, and Mary Ann rode home with the distinct, uncomfortable sense that she had just been told a great deal by a man who believed himself to have told her nothing at all. She thought of the old man's careful blankness rather often in the weeks that followed, whenever her own courage flagged in the long, dusty hours of the muniment room. Whatever had happened to the drainage fund in 1815, it had not been forgotten by the tenants who lived with the consequence of it every winter tide. Only it seemed by the family whose name was on the deed. The first key opened onto a room that had not been aired. Mary Ann judged from the smell of it in a decade at least. It stood at the end of the east wing, behind a door of black oak bound in iron. And when she pushed it open, the September light, for it was September now, the wedding 3 months behind her, and the wheat already cut in the fields, beyond the beech wood, fell across a long table furred with dust and 2 walls of cabinets, floor to ceiling, each drawer labeled in a hand she did not recognize with years she did. She carried in a branch of candles, though it was still daylight outside, because the room had only one small window, deep set and grown over with ivy on the exterior side, and she meant to be thorough. She had told Mrs. Pargeter she would take a cold luncheon on a tray rather than come down, and had asked, with the same flat courtesy she had used for the key, that she not be disturbed. She began, for lack of any better system, at the year she cared about. The drawer marked 1,815 held estate correspondence, mostly tenant disputes, a long exchange of letters about the enclosure of a common the parish had fought over for 2 years, a bundle of receipts for repairs to the sea-wall at Clay that had apparently failed again the following winter regardless. She read every page. It was slow work and dull, and twice she had to stop and press the heel of her hand hard against her own breastbone, because dullness was not what she had expected to feel. Sitting in the room that held the truth about her father, and the feeling that came in it, a kind of grinding, patient tedium, frightened her rather more than grief would have. She found what she had come for in the 3rd hour in a folder near the back of the drawer, 8 sheets of paper in a clerk's careful copying hand, headed in the matter of E. Selwyn-esque, and certain irregularities touching the Clee drainage subscription. It was, on its face, exactly what the world had always been told. In the spring of 1815, the account read, Sir Edmund Selwyn, then a subscriber and trustee to a fund raised among the local landowners for the repair of the sea defenses along the Clee shore, had been found to have drawn against the fund for his own private debts, some £400 in total, and had made good the sum only after the irregularity was discovered by the late Earl's own steward. The late Earl, the account went on, in a tone of measured and regretful generosity, had chosen not to press the matter to a public reckoning, out of consideration for the Selwyn family and for Sir Edmund's own long acquaintance with the House of Ashcombe, and had accepted instead Sir Edmund's private undertaking to withdraw from public life and from the management of any further public moneys. Marianne read it 3 times. It was neat. It was plausible. It was, she thought, precisely the sort of document a family might produce to justify, to itself and to any future reader who came asking, a kindness it had done a ruined neighbor, and it explained absolutely nothing about why her father, a man who had never in her memory shown the least appetite for cards or debt or any of the ordinary vices that emptied a gentleman's pockets, should have needed £400 badly enough to steal it, nor why a fund £400 richer for its return should still 10 years later have left a stretch of seawall at Clay in the state of collapse she had heard the tenants complain of on her very first ride out from the house. She copied the 8 pages, word for word, into the back of her own notebook in case the originals were ever to disappear, and sat a long while afterward with her candle burning low, looking not at the papers but at the cabinet drawers stretching away into the dim of the room, at all the years she had not yet opened, and thought, this is the story they have agreed to tell. It is not the same thing as the truth. Mrs. Aldous Fenn, wife of the rector at Salthouse Parish, called at Ashcombe Park that same week, ostensibly to welcome the new countess properly to the neighborhood, and stayed the better part of 2 hours over tea, in which time Marianne learned rather more about her own family's history in the county than she had managed to learn in 22 years of actually living in it. "You'll forgive me for saying so, my lady," Mrs. Fenn said, over her second cup, with the particular relish of a woman who has been waiting a decade for an appropriate occasion to say something, and has finally, providentially, been handed one. But there was a great deal of talk, in my husband's early years in the parish, about your father's affairs. I don't repeat it to distress you, quite the contrary. I always thought it a very great shame, myself, that a man should be so thoroughly and so permanently reduced in the world's opinion for what struck me, even at the time, as rather a small sum of money to have ruined a gentleman's whole reputation over. You thought the sum small? £400, was it not? A great deal to a laboring family, of course, but hardly the sort of figure that generally sinks a baronet entirely out of society for a decade and more. I always did wonder, though it was not my place to say so, above a whisper at the time, whether there wasn't rather more to the business than the county was ever told. Mrs. Fenn set down her cup and looked at Mary Ann with an expression that was, for all its careful social varnish, unmistakably kind. But there, I've said more than I ought, and you a bride not 4 months married into the very family concerned. You'll think me a dreadful gossip. I think you may be a rather more observant one than most of the county has given you credit for, Mrs. Fenn. The rector's wife left an hour later, well pleased with her visit and entirely unaware that she had confirmed, in the space of a single indiscreet afternoon, precisely the suspicion that had sent Mary Ann into the muniment room in the first place, that the story the world had been told about her father's disgrace had never quite added up, even to the people who had been asked for 10 years to believe it without question. She had brought, tucked into her reticule that morning, without quite admitting to herself why, the last letter her mother had ever written her, posted only days before the fever that took Lady Selwyn in the autumn of 1822, a letter Mary Ann had read so many times in the 3 years since that she no longer needed to unfold it to recall the single line in it that had sent her, that morning, into this room with a candle and a borrowed key. If ever you are made mistress of a house not your own, and you find a room no one wishes you to enter, go in. Your father lost everything by staying out of rooms he ought to have gone into. I did not raise you to make his mistake twice. She had not understood the line when she first read it, grieving and 18 and certain her mother's mind had wandered in those last fevered days. She understood it a great deal better now, sitting in a room full of drawers, with a document in her lap that told a story too clean by half. The newspapers that reached Ashcombe Park came 3 days old from London, and Mary Ann had taken, since the summer, to reading them through rather than setting them aside for her husband's return, in the way of a woman with a great deal of time and very little company. There was a persistent, low note running through the financial columns that August and September that she did not fully understand but had begun, almost without noticing, to track talk of the new mining ventures in the Spanish-American provinces, trading thin and falling thinner, of 1 or 2 country banks in the Midlands said to be calling in loans rather sooner than their customers had been led to expect, of gentlemen in the city advising caution to friends who 6 months before had been advised the opposite. It meant nothing to her directly. She had no money in mines, but she had begun to notice, the way one notices weather changing before the change itself arrives, that the tone of the columns had shifted from confidence to caution in the space of a single season, and she filed the noticing away, as she filed everything else, without yet knowing what it would be wanted for. She went back to the muniment room the next morning, and the morning after that, working forward now from 1815 rather than pausing there, because she had begun to suspect that whatever had truly happened that spring had not ended with a single irregular withdrawal and a quiet understanding between gentlemen. The drawers for 1816 and 1817 told a story of a family quietly and steadily prospering, rents collected, Improvements made to the home farm, a new roof for the chapel, a subscription to a hospital in Norwich that struck Marianne, reading the correspondence around it as rather more generous than the family's ordinary habits of charity seemed to warrant. She found nothing in either year that referred to her father by name, or to the drainage fund again at all, which she noted, in the margin of her own notebook, as its own kind of curiosity, a matter closed so completely, after 1,815, that it might never have existed in a family otherwise inclined to keep meticulous records of every lesser transaction that crossed the estate's books. By the end of September, she had begun, almost without deciding to take up the ordinary business of the house in the gaps between her mornings among the cabinets, approving menus, settling a dispute between the head gardener and the new undergroom over the use of a particular cart, writing, in her own hand, rather than dictating to a steward, letters of condolence to two tenant families who had lost children to a fever that swept the low cottages near the marsh that autumn. Mrs. Pargeter, who had watched 3 previous mistresses of Ashcombe Park come and go in her 30 years of service, remarked once to the cook, within careless earshot of a housemaid, who later repeated it to Marianne herself with evident pride, that her ladyship had more sense in her little finger than the last 2 countesses put together, and a deal more backbone besides. Marianne did not know, hearing it, whether to feel flattered or faintly alarmed at how much of her own carefully guarded resolve had apparently become visible to a household she had believed she was managing to keep entirely in the dark. On the 4th morning, running her hand along the inside back panel of the cabinet marked 1,816 to 1,818, while she searched for a missing folder, she felt the wood give, very slightly, beneath her fingers, not the give of old, dry timber, but the deliberate give of a panel built to move. The panel came away with a firm push rather than a pull, sliding sideways into a recess that had been fitted, she guessed from the fineness of the joinery, by the same hand that had built the cabinets themselves, no forced hiding place, but a compartment planned into the room from the start, meant for a man who wanted somewhere in his own house that even a wife or a steward could not stumble upon by accident. Behind it, wrapped in oiled cloth against the damp, was a ledger bound in dark leather, considerably older and more worn than anything else in the room, and beneath it a smaller bundle of loose papers, tied with plain string rather than the red official ribbon she had expected from a family so fond of documenting its own generosity. She untied the string first, because her hands, she found, did not want to open the ledger yet. The loose papers were letters, a dozen of them, in 2 different hands. The first hand she recognized, with a small cold shock. From the cabinet drawers she had already read the late Earl's own, Marcus Fanshaw's, a firm, downward-sloping copper plate that grew visibly less steady across the dozen letters, as though the man writing them had aged a decade in the space of whatever correspondence they represented. The second hand she did not know at all, cramped and rapid, the writing of a man in a hurry or a man afraid of being read over his own shoulder. She began with the earliest, dated the 11th of April, 1,815. It was not, she understood within the first 3 lines, a letter about a drainage subscription at all. It was a letter from Marcus Fanshawe to a man addressed only as R, thanking him for the delivery of 11 casks the previous week and enclosing payment for the same, at a rate the letter did not trouble to explain because both correspondents plainly already understood it. The second letter, a fortnight later, spoke of a revenue cutter that had come uncomfortably close to the Clay Inlet on a Tuesday night and would need, the writer suggested, some persuading to look elsewhere on future occasions, the usual sum having evidently ceased to answer. The third letter used, for the first time, a phrase that made Mary Ann set the pages down on the table and press both hands flat against the wood until they stopped, very slightly shaking. The prize accounts from the old business. She read on. The ledger, when she finally opened it, made a slow and terrible sense of the phrase. It was a record, kept in Marcus Fanshauer's own hand from as early as 1808, of sums received as a prize agent for 2 frigates that had taken French and American merchantmen off the Norfolk coast during the war, a wholly respectable office, one held by dozens of gentlemen of consequence, whose task was only to see that captured cargo was properly valued, sold, and the proceeds justly divided among captains, officers, and crew according to the Navy's own scale. Except that the sums entered in this ledger did not match, Mary Ann saw within a quarter of an hour of careful reading the sums that could plausibly have reached the sailors who had actually done the fighting. Cargoes were undervalued on the books and sold on privately for their true worth. Prize money owed to men long since dead, or discharged, or simply too far away to inquire closely into their own accounts, had been quietly retained rather than distributed, on the reasoning, set down once in the margin in Marcus's own hand, that a dead man's share troubles no one who does not go looking for it. And when the war ended in 1815, and the prizes and the frigates and the whole legitimate apparatus of it ended with it, the ledger did not end. It continued, in the same hand, tracking instead a new and simpler traffic, brandy and lace and tobacco run in by night through the same coves the Navy cutters had once patrolled. Using Mary Ann, read this twice to be certain. She had understood it: the same boats, the same local men, the same small, useful network of silence that 10 years of prize money irregularities had already built and paid for, and bound together with a decade of shared guilt. Among the names recurring most often in the later pages paid, in small regular sums, for what the ledger called only carrying was a Blakeney boatman entered simply as S. Otway, a name that meant nothing to Mary Ann on this first reading, and that she would not think of again until a letter from her brother, weeks later, taught her exactly how much it ought to have meant. It was this second, later portion of the ledger, dated the summer of 1815, that named her father. Selwyn came to me the 14th, Marcus had written, in a hand pressed hard enough into the page that Mary Ann could feel the indentation beneath her fingers even now, having somehow got wind of the R. business through his man at Clay, a fool of a bailiff who ought to be turned off, and made it plain he meant to lay information before the excise unless the accounts were open to him. I told him there were no accounts to open. He did not believe me, and said as much, in terms I did not care for from a man of his standing, which is to say none at all. The next letter, dated 4 days later, was in the second hand, the cramped, hurried one, and addressed to Marcus directly. Mary Ann understood, reading it, that she was looking at a letter from Josiah. You will not silence him with money. He is not built for it. But he has debts of his own. Every man of that sort does somewhere, and a signature is a signature, once it is on the wrong paper. Let me see what can be arranged. A charge that frightens him badly enough will do what persuasion cannot, and he will thank us for the lesser one once he has understood the size of the greater. Mary Ann set the letter down. She sat for a long moment with her hands flat on the table, not reading, only breathing, while the single candle burned down another half-inch, and the light in the small, deep-set window went from gray to the flat white of a Norfolk afternoon with rain not far off. She had grown up believing, because it was the only account anyone had ever offered her, because her father had never once, in 10 years, corrected it in her hearing, that Sir Edmund Selwyn had done something shameful and been quietly, mercifully spared the full consequence of it by a neighbor's generosity. She understood now that the shame had run the other way entirely. Her father had found something he was never meant to find, had done the honest and dangerous thing of saying so aloud, and had been answered not with generosity, but with a forged signature and a threat of the gallows dressed up for the world's benefit as an act of Christian forbearance. The final document in the bundle confirmed it, beyond any further doubt she might have wished to hold on to. It was a copy, in Josiah's hand, of a bill of exchange bearing what purported to be Sir Edmund Selwyn's signature, a signature Marianne had seen 1,000 times on 1,000 ordinary letters, and which was not. Looking at it now beside those ordinary letters in her memory, quite right in the slant of the E, or the closing loop of the final N. Beneath it, in the same cramped hand, a single line E. S. shown this on the 19th. Agreed at once to the lesser charge, rather than risk the greater being proved against him in a court that need never see this paper at all, provided he holds his tongue and troubles no one further. Marcus satisfied. Land question to be settled separately in time. Forgery was a hanging matter. Marianne did not need anyone to tell her that. Every literate person in England knew it, the way they knew. The price of bread knew it from the broadsheets sold outside Newgate on the mornings the sentence was carried out, from the black-bordered notices in the county papers, from the plain, unremarkable fact that a man could be walked from the dock to the gallows in under a fortnight for putting another man's name to a piece of paper. Her father had been shown a forged bill bearing his own signature and told, in effect, that the only alternative to a public trial for his life was a private confession to a lesser theft he had not committed either. He had chosen the theft. Of course he had chosen the theft. Any man with a wife and 2 young children would have chosen the theft and lived the rest of his life a smaller, quieter man for it, and never once told his children why. Because what was there to tell them that would not simply hand the Fanshaws a second time the very silence they had bought so dearly the first? Land question to be settled separately, in time. Marianne read that line perhaps a dozen times before she understood, fully and all at once, what she herself had actually become. Not a bride acquired for a convenient parcel of marshland, as she had told herself, with something almost like relief. In the weeks after the wedding, a transaction cold enough to be borne, at least without any particular cruelty behind it. She was the final installment of a debt her father had been paying since 1815, settled at last, 10 years late, in the person of his own daughter. She did not weep. She had promised herself, in the ink of a commonplace book locked in a desk drawer 30 feet above her head, that she would not, and she found, sitting alone in a room that had not been aired in a decade, with the truth of her whole life laid open across a dusty table, that the promise held. What she did instead, for the better part of an hour, was copy every letter, every ledger entry that bore her father's name, or Marcus Fanshaw's, or the initial R, into the back pages of her own notebook, in a hand that grew steadier rather than less steady as the hour wore on, because there is a particular kind of calm, she discovered, that arrives only after the worst has already been confirmed, and there is nothing left to do but begin. She wrote to Mr. Coombs that same evening, before she had eaten, before she had even changed out of the plain gray gown she wore for her mornings in the muniment room. She did not copy the documents into the letter itself. Some instinct, sharpened rather than dulled by the day's discoveries, told her that a letter could be read by other eyes before it reached Norwich, and that the safest place for what she had found was inside her own head and her own locked notebook, until she understood a great deal more about who else might already know it. She wrote instead that she had found matter touching her father's affairs of the year 1815 and 15 that she believed her mother had wished her to find, that she recalled her mother's trust in Mr. Coombs specifically and hoped it had not been misplaced, and that she would be glad of his earliest convenience in coming to Ashcombe Park or in receiving her in Norwich, whichever he judged wiser. She sealed it with her own ring rather than the household seal, and paid the carrier from her own pin money rather than have it entered in the estate accounts her uncle-in-law reviewed each quarter. The £200 a year settled on her by the marriage articles pin money, the lawyers called it, in the deliberately trivializing language such settlements always seemed to use for the one sum in a married woman's life that remained. By law and by careful drafting, entirely her own to dispose of, had struck Marianne, when the terms were first read to her before the wedding, as a small and almost insulting provision. She understood its value rather better now. It was not a great deal of money. It was, however, money no husband's steward need ever see entered against his name. And in the circumstances she had found herself in since September, that plain, unglamorous fact had become worth considerably more to her than the sum itself. Theo's second letter arrived 4 days later, in a hand considerably steadier than the first, though still favoring the right margin in a way that suggested his arm had not fully recovered its old confidence. I am well enough now to tell you properly what happened, and what I have since learned, which is rather more to the point. The men who set upon me on the Thetford road were not simple footpads, whatever the magistrate at Wotton wishes to believe. They took the satchel and left my purse, which no honest thief in England has ever done in the history of the road. I have since gone, as soon as I could sit a horse without disgracing myself, to Blakeney, where I found I will not tell you how. It involved rather more patience with unfriendly innkeepers than I cared to admit to an old sailing man named Silas Otway, who builds small boats now and says very little to strangers, but who knew our father's name the instant I said it, and went the color of tallow, and told me, before he thought better of it and shut his mouth for a full quarter-hour, that he had once carried cargo for men whose names he would not say for any money I could offer him. I believe, Marianne, that whatever is in that satchel, and whatever you may find at Ashcombe, this Otway knows the rest of it. I do not think he will speak to me again without considerable persuading. I do not know whether he would speak to you at all. Marianne read the letter twice, standing at the same window where she had read the first, and felt something shift in her chest that was not quite hope, and not quite dread, but shared the shape of both, a witness, a living man who had carried the same cargo the ledger described, who had gone the color of tallow at the mere mention of her father's name, which meant, she understood at once, that whatever Silas Otway knew, he knew it well enough to be afraid of it still, 10 years on. She was still standing at the window with the letter in her hand when she heard, from the direction of the forecourt, the commotion of a large traveling coach, arriving unannounced grooms called out of the stable at a run, gravel thrown up under hooves moving faster than a polite arrival warranted. She looked out and saw her husband's coach, 3 weeks before he had written to say he would come, and her husband himself already down from it and crossing the forecourt with the long, purposeful stride of a man who has decided something on the road and means to act on it before he loses his nerve. She folded Theo's letter once and then again, and slipped it inside the bodice of her gown, against the older letter she had carried there since the day of her wedding, and went down to meet him with her face arranged into the same composed and unremarkable smile she had worn since the nave of St. George's, though she understood, walking down the stairs with 2 letters pressed against her heart like a second, doubled pulse, that the smile was going to be a great deal harder to hold steady now than it had ever been before. He met her in the hall, still in his traveling coat, and did not offer the usual courtesies of an unexpected arrival. "I've had a letter from my uncle," Sebastian said, "informing me that you have taken to spending your mornings in the muniment room. He seemed to think I would wish to know. I did wonder how long it would take him to think so. You might have written and told me yourself, rather than let me hear it from a man who clearly meant it as a warning." Was it meant as a warning? He looked at her for a moment without answering, in the way she had come to recognize over the summer as the look of a man doing sums he did not entirely trust the answer to. "I don't know what it was meant as," he said finally. "That is rather the trouble, madam. I find I don't know what a good many things in my own house are meant as, and I have begun, since this morning's letter, to think that is not entirely by accident." She might, in that moment, have told him everything. She felt the words gather briefly. At the back of her throat, the ledger, the letters. Her father's name reduced to 2 initials in a stranger's careful hand. But she had not yet written to Mr. Coombs for his opinion of what she'd found, had not yet decided how much of it could safely be trusted to a man whose own uncle stood accused within it, however lightly, by association alone. The moment passed, and with it, she understood even as it closed, some portion of the trust she might otherwise have built with him that evening. "I should like to know," he said, when she offered nothing further, "whether you intend to tell me eventually, or whether I am meant to go on hearing of my own wife's activities from my uncle's letters for the whole of our marriage." "Eventually," she said, "when I understand it well enough myself to explain it without doing more harm than good in the telling." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his face, not quite trust, not yet, but the deliberate suspension of its opposite, seemed to settle, however uneasily, into place. "Then I'll wait," he said, "but not indefinitely, madam. A man can only be asked to trust a locked door for so long before he starts wondering whether the trusting was ever meant to be returned." He left her standing in the hall, and she climbed the stairs to her own room a little while later with the distinct, uncomfortable sense that she had just won a small, hollow victory in a contest she had not entirely meant to be fighting. He did not press her again that first night, though she saw, watching him across the dinner table, in a room built to seat 30 and laid that evening for 2, that the not pressing cost him something. He asked instead, in the careful, sideways manner of a man unused to asking anyone anything he could not already guess the answer to, what she had found in the muniment room that had kept her occupied 3 mornings out of 5 since August. "Estate history," she said, which was true, in the narrowest possible sense of the word. "It's a strange feeling, coming into a house with 300 years behind it and knowing none of the years. You might have asked me, rather than my uncle's cabinets. You were in London. I am here now." She looked at him then, properly, across the candles and the cold soup neither of them had touched, and understood that she had arrived at the exact crossing she had known, since the muniment room she would eventually have to cross, whether to tell him tonight everything she had found, and trust a man she had known 4 months with the one thing that could unmake his family entirely, or to hold it a while longer, as she had held everything else, until she understood better which parts of him belonged to his uncle, and which, if any, belonged only to himself. "I found some old accounts," she said, "concerning my father. Nothing that need trouble you tonight." It was not quite a lie. It was, she thought, watching something close, very slightly behind his eyes, very nearly as bad as one. He did not ask again that night. He talked instead, unprompted, in the unhurried way of a man filling a silence he did not entirely trust, about his own father, a subject she had never once heard him raise before, not at the wedding, not in any of the 4 brief months of their acquaintance. He changed. The last year of his life, Sebastian said, turning his wineglass slowly by the stem without drinking from it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was 25, in London, occupied with my own affairs. One is, at that age, rather thoroughly occupied with one's own affairs. But he took to sitting up late in his study, and Mrs. Pargetter's predecessor told my sister once, I have a sister. Did you know that? Married now, in Ireland. We write twice a year, and mean rather more by it than the frequency suggests, that she'd come in some mornings to find the grate full of burnt paper, and my father asleep in his chair with his boots still on, as though he'd meant to go to bed and thought better of it at the door. Did you ever ask him about it? No, he said it simply, without excuse. He died rather suddenly, in the February after, and I was in London when the express reached me, and by the time I arrived home, there was nothing left to ask. I've thought, since, that there might have been something he wanted to tell me and didn't manage it in time. I've never had any particular reason to think so, beyond the burnt paper and the boots. It's not the sort of thing a man builds a theory on. Marianne sat very still, with the 2 letters pressed against her heart beneath her bodice, and did not tell him that she might, in fact, be able to build rather more of a theory on it than he supposed. What sort of man was he? She asked instead, because it was, she told herself, a fair question for a wife to ask of a husband's dead father, and not at all an attempt to gather evidence across a dinner table from a man who did not yet know he was being questioned. Formidable, Sebastian said, after a moment's consideration. Clever. Not, I think, entirely happy, though I could not have told you why at the time. He was very hard on my uncle, oddly harder than he was on me, though Josiah was the one who'd given up his own prospects to help manage the estate. I used to think it was simple unfairness, the sort of thing an elder brother sometimes visits on a younger one out of nothing more than old habit. I've wondered lately whether it might have been something else. He looked at her as he said it, a long, level look that held, for the first time since their wedding day, something that was not quite suspicion, but was close enough to its neighbor that Marianne felt the whole of her carefully built composure tightened by one further, deliberate degree. You've wondered about a great many things tonight, she said. So I think, have you? He set down his glass, untouched, and rose from the table before the second course had properly begun. With the stiff, formal courtesy of a man retreating from a field he had not yet decided whether to call a defeat. Good night, madam. I find I've rather lost my appetite. She sat alone at the table for some time after he had gone, listening to his footsteps recede up the great staircase, and thought not for the first time, though with rather more force than before, that the promise she had written into her commonplace book, the one about never asking twice, had not accounted at all for the considerably harder question of when and how much to ask the very first time. He returned to London for a fortnight in the last week of September, called back by the ordinary business of the trust accounts, and, though he did not say so directly, by some evident wish to put a little distance between himself and a wife whose secrets he had not yet learned to sit comfortably beside. He wrote to her twice in that fortnight, brief, careful letters concerning estate matters that gradually, by the second letter, began to include small observations that had nothing to do with drainage surveys or tenant repairs. At all a play he had seen and found tedious, a dinner at which Denbrook had told the same story about the peninsula he told at every dinner, a passing mention, that London in September, without her, struck him as considerably duller than he would have predicted 4 months before. Marianne answered both letters in kind, matching his careful, sideways honesty with a little of her own nothing of the muniment room, but small true things nonetheless, that Mrs. Pargetter had taken to bringing her tea in the small sitting room without being asked. On the morning she came down looking, in the housekeeper's own careful phrase, not quite herself, that she had begun, in the evenings, to read her way through the library's rather better collection of natural philosophy than she had expected to find in a gentleman's country house, that the beech wood had turned color a full week earlier than the tenants said was usual, and that she found she minded the early dark rather less than she had expected to, alone in a house that was slowly, in small and unremarkable ways, beginning to feel less like a room she was waiting to be asked to leave. It was not courtship. Precisely neither of them would have called it that in the autumn of 1825, with a decade-old fraud still unproven between them and a marriage settled for reasons that had nothing to do with affection. But it was, Marianne thought, rereading his second letter by candlelight on an October evening not long before express from Blakeney arrived and changed the shape of everything between them, something rather more than the careful, transactional courtesy either of them had expected to be the whole of their arrangement. The weeks that followed his return settled into an uneasy but not unfriendly truce. Sebastian did not press her again about the muniment room, though she caught him, more than once, watching her across a room with an unresolved, watchful attention. The attention of a man keeping his own counsel about a question he had not abandoned so much as set carefully aside. He rode out with her twice that October, ostensibly to inspect the tenant cottages nearest the marsh before the worst of the winter weather set in, and Marianne found, on both occasions, that the easy, unhurried company of a man on horseback beside her, no table between them, no careful arrangement of faces for an audience of servants, suited her rather better than any of the formal dinners they had shared since June. "You ride well," he said, on the second of these outings, with the faint surprise of a man revising an assumption he had not realized he'd been making. "Better than most women of my acquaintance, certainly better than my own sister ever managed, and she had considerably more instruction than I imagine you did. My father taught me himself, when I was young enough, that no one had yet thought to tell either of us it was an unsuitable pastime for a baronet's daughter. We had very little else to spend money on, those years, and a horse was cheaper than a dancing master." He was quiet for a moment, and she saw him turn the sentence over, the way she had come to recognize. He turned over most things she told him about her family, weighing it, she suspected, against whatever fragments of the old story he had grown up half believing, without ever quite examining. "I should like to have known him before all this," he said finally. "Your father, I mean. Whatever else is true, I think I should have liked him." "You still might," Marianne said, "if this ends the way I mean it to." It was, she understood even as she said it, the closest either of them had yet come to admitting aloud that there wasn't this to end it all, that the careful, courteous distance they maintained across every dinner table was itself only a kind of held breath, waiting on a reckoning neither of them had yet named plainly between themselves. Sebastian did not press her to say more, and she did not offer it, and they rode the rest of the way back to Ashcombe Park in a silence that felt, for the first time since her wedding day, less like a wall between them than like a bridge still under construction. The express reached Ashcombe Park on the 9th of October, carried by a rider who had changed horses twice between Blakeney and the house, and arrived, Mrs. Pargeter reported afterward, looking as though he had aged a year on the road. Marianne had been in the small sitting room when Mrs. Pargeter came to find her, a good hour before the ordinary time for the day's post, with a face that told most of the story before a single word of it was spoken. She had learned, over 4 months in this house, to read the weight of the housekeeper's silences, and this one carried a heaviness that made her set down her needlework and rise before Mrs. Pargeter had finished crossing the threshold. "There's a rider come from Blakeney, my lady, half dead with the pace of it, and asking most particular for you and no one else. The writer stood in the hall still in his mud-spattered coat, refusing, with the stubborn courtesy of a man under strict instruction, to hand the letter to anyone but Marianne herself. And she took it from him with hands that had gone, she noticed almost distantly, entirely and unnaturally steady, a steadiness she had come to recognize over these autumn months, not as calm but as its opposite, the stillness of a body bracing itself before the worst news it has learned, by hard experience, to expect. Theo had been attacked a second time, on the coast lane between Blakeney and Clay, in broad daylight, by two men on horseback who had not troubled to disguise themselves at all. A carelessness, or a confidence, that struck Marianne. Reading the note with her hands gone entirely steady, the way they went steady now, whenever the news was worst, as considerably more frightening than the darkness and anonymity of the first attack in the summer. He had been struck from his horse and beaten badly enough that the Blakeney surgeon who first attended him would not yet say, in the note the writer carried, whether he would keep the use of his right arm. He was alive. He was, for the present, being kept at the surgeon's own house rather than moved, on the advice that moving him further might do more harm than the beating already had. The note carried one further piece of information, added in a different, rounder hand than Theo's own. The surgeon's, Marianne understood. A man evidently sensible enough to know what mattered, and honest enough to include it, though no one had asked him to. A boy delivering milk to the surgeon's house that same morning, arriving just as the attack broke up, had seen the two riders clearly enough to describe the elder of them as wearing a green coat with a crest on the button he had noticed, because his own father worked, some years back, at a great house and had once shown him what a coat of arms looked like on a livery button. The boy could not read the crest. He could describe it. A hawk, he thought, or some manner of bird, rising from a coronet. Marianne had seen that crest 100 times since June. It was stamped on the Ashcombe carriage doors, embroidered on the household livery, cut into the seal Sebastian used for his correspondence, and the smaller, plainer seal Josiah used for his. She sat with the letter a long while before she carried it to her husband, not out of any renewed instinct toward secrecy. That instinct, she found, had finally and completely burned itself out somewhere in the space between reading the surgeon's careful, unwilling description and understanding what it meant, but because she needed, first, to sit with the specific shape of her own failure before she could stand in front of anyone else and admit to it. She had known, since September, that whatever her father had discovered in 1815 was dangerous enough to have been bought with a forged signature and a threat of the gallows. She had known, since Theo's second letter, that Silas Otway was afraid enough of it still to go the color of tallow at the mere mention of her father's name. She had known all of this, and she had said nothing to her husband, out of a caution that had felt, at the time, like prudence, and looked now, with her brother, lying in a strange surgeon's house, with a ruined arm and a Fanshawe crest on the coat of the man who had put him there, exactly like what it had actually been, a choice to protect a plan rather than a person, made by a woman who had told herself in ink that she would never beg anyone for anything, and had somehow allowed that vow to curdle, without her quite noticing the moment it happened, into a refusal to ask for help at all. If she had told Sebastian in September what she had found in the muniment room, if she had trusted him, or tested him, or simply taken the risk of being wrong about him, 3 weeks earlier than she eventually did, there would have been men sent to watch the Blakeney road. There would have been, at the very least, a warning carried to Theo faster than a letter traveling at the ordinary pace of the post. She could not know, and told herself sternly she must not pretend to know, that this would certainly have prevented what had happened on the coast lane. But she could not tell herself either, with any honesty at all, that it would certainly have made no difference. She found Sebastian in the estate office, going over quarterly accounts with an expression of concentration she recognized from her own weeks in the muniment room as the look of a person trying very hard not to notice something wrong with the numbers in front of them. She put the express letter down on the desk without a word because she found, when she opened her mouth to explain it, that there were no longer any words she trusted herself to choose in the correct order. He read it twice, she saw, exactly as she had. He set it down with a hand that was not quite steady, and looked up at her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "Greencoat," he said finally. "A hawk rising from a coronet. Yes, my uncle wears a green coat to travel in. He has done for as long as I've known him." Sebastian's voice, when it came, was very quiet and very controlled, in the way of a man holding a much louder voice in check by main force. "Marianne, what is it you found in that room?" she told him. "All of it." This time, the drainage account and the panel that gave way beneath her fingers, the ledger and the prize money and the 11 casks and the forged bill, her father's stolen decade and the debt that had, at the last, been settled in the person of his own daughter. She told him standing, because she did not trust herself to sit through it, and he listened without once interrupting her, his face going, by degrees, the particular gray-white of a man watching the floor of his own life give way beneath him one board at a time. When she had finished, he did not defend his uncle. He did not, which she had half feared he might, defend his father either. He sat very still for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice she had not heard from him before, stripped entirely of the careful, level register he had used at the altar and had used, in one form or another, every day since. "Why did you not tell me this in September?" It was the question she had been dreading since she read the surgeon's note, and she found, now that it had actually been asked, that she owed him the plain answer, rather than any of the several kinder ones available to her. "Because I did not know, in September, whether you were a man I could trust with it, or a man who would carry it straight to your uncle the moment my back was turned. I chose to protect what I'd found rather than risk finding out which you were. I told myself it was prudence. I think now, it may simply have been fear dressed up as prudence, and I think my brother may have paid a piece of the price for my dressing it up so carefully." He did not answer that at once. When he did, it was not the answer she had expected. "I understand why you did it," he said. "I am not certain I forgive you for it yet. Both of those things are true at once, and I don't propose to pretend otherwise, for the sake of making this conversation easier for either of us." He stood and came around the desk, and, for the first time since their wedding day, put his hand, briefly and without ceremony, over hers where it rested on the desk's edge. "But whatever you decide to trust me with, from this point forward, you will not decide it alone again. Your brother is lying half broken in a surgeon's house because two of us were keeping separate counsel about the same danger. I should like that to be the last time either of us makes that particular mistake." "I won't," she said, and found that the promise, unlike so many others she had made in the past months, came without any reservation at all behind it. "I think I convinced myself, somewhere in the last 2 months, that carrying everything alone was a kind of strength. I begin to understand it was rather closer to a kind of fear dressed up in strength's clothing, and that the two are not nearly as similar as I'd let myself believe. We're neither of us especially good at this yet," Sebastian said, with something that might, in a lighter moment, have been the beginning of a smile. "Marriage, I mean, or trust. I'm not entirely certain which of the two is giving us more trouble. Both, I should think, in roughly equal measure. Then we'll have to manage them both at once, and hope one makes the other easier rather than harder. He looked toward the window, where the last of the hot daylight was failing over the beech wood, and his expression sobered again. But not tonight. Tonight we ride for Blakeney, and we find out how badly my family has hurt yours, and we begin, properly, to put it right. They rode for Blakeney within the hour, Sebastian giving orders along the way, with a crispness Marianne had not seen in him before. A physician sent ahead from Norwich, word carried to the nearest magistrate. A groom dispatched to Clyde to warn the tenants there had been violence on the coast road and to keep to the house after dark. It was, she understood, watching him work, the first time she had seen him act as a man fully in command of his own estate, rather than a man managing around the edges of an arrangement someone else had built for him. They reached the surgeon's house in Blakeney by nightfall, and found Theo propped up in a narrow bed, with his right arm bound tightly to his chest, and a bruise along his jaw gone the color of a stormy sky, but awake and irritable in the way of a young man, more frustrated by his own helplessness than frightened by the danger that had caused it. "I told the surgeon I could ride home within the week," he said, by way of greeting, before Marianne had even crossed the threshold, "and he tells me I'll be lucky to lift a teacup unassisted by Christmas. I begin to think surgeons enjoy delivering bad news rather more than the occasion strictly warrants. Theo." Marianne crossed the small room in 3 steps and took his good hand in both of hers, and, to her own considerable surprise, that the careful composure she had maintained since June threatened, for the first time in months, to give way entirely. "You might have died on that road. I didn't, though. And I got a rather better look at one of them than they'd have liked, before the second fellow struck me down, which I understand from your husband's face just now is proving rather more useful than either of them bargained for." He looked past her to Sebastian, standing in the doorway with an expression Marianne had not seen on him before, something between guilt and fierce, unpracticed protectiveness. "You're the Earl, then. I confess I pictured you rather differently from the little Marianne wrote me before the wedding." "Differently how?" "Colder," Theo said, with the blunt honesty of a young man raised by a sister who had never once encouraged him toward tact. "I'm glad to find I was wrong, though I'll reserve final judgment until I see how the business with your uncle actually concludes." Sebastian came further into the room, and to Marianne's quiet astonishment, did not take offense at the young man's plain speaking, but seemed, if anything, to relax slightly in the face of it, as though bluntness, after 4 months of careful, measured courtesies, came almost as a relief. "A fair condition," he said. "I intend to see that it concludes properly, whatever it costs to manage it. You have my word on that, for whatever a Fanshawe's word is presently worth to a Selwyn. We'll find out, won't we?" Theo said. But he said it without malice, and put out his good hand, and Sebastian shook it, and Marianne, watching the 2 men she loved most in the world take each other's measure across a narrow surgeon's bed, felt something in her chest ease very slightly for the first time, in what felt like a very long year indeed. They spent 2 further days in Blakeney before returning to Ashcombe Park, the Sebastian using the time to make his own quiet inquiries along the coast road at the inn where the attackers' horses had reportedly been changed, at the toll gate where a keeper remembered 2 riders passing through at speed on the morning in question, at the small chandlery in Clay, where Sebastian learned with a coldness that settled into his chest and did not entirely lift it again. For days afterward, his uncle's own coachman had been seen purchasing rope and a quantity of lamp oil not 3 days before the attack, for reasons the chandler had not thought to question at the time. None of it, taken piece by piece, would have satisfied a magistrate. Taken together, laid out on the estate office desk beside Marianne's own careful notes from the muniment room, It built a picture neither of them could any longer pretend not to see clearly. A man who had known, since the interview about the milk boy's description, that his own nephew suspected him, and had begun, in the days since, the careful, practical business of a man preparing to silence a danger by whatever means came most readily to hand. Josiah was in Norwich when the message reached Ashcombe Park, 2 days later, summoned home by Sebastian's own express, with no explanation aught beyond a request that he come at his earliest convenience to discuss a matter touching the estate's finances. He arrived on the third day. In the green traveling coat, Marianne had by then spent 2 days trying not to look at every time it crossed her mind, and was shown, at Sebastian's instruction, not into the drawing room but into the estate office, where the quarterly accounts still lay open on the desk beside the express letter from Blakeney. "You wish to see me," Josiah said, and Marianne, standing by the window where Sebastian had asked her to stay, watched him take in the room, the ledgers, his nephew's face, and adjust his own expression by some small, almost invisible degree before he had finished crossing the threshold. Lady Ashcombe's brother was set upon on the Blakeney road 4 days ago, Sebastian said, without preamble. Struck from his horse, beaten badly enough that the surgeon isn't yet certain of his arm. A milk boy who happened on the scene as it broke up described one of the 2 riders as wearing a green coat with a crest button, a hawk rising from a coronet. Josiah's face did not move for a long moment. Then it did, in the careful way of a man rearranging his features for an audience he has just realized is more attentive than he had planned for. "A great many gentlemen in this county wear a green coat, Sebastian. It is hardly a family crest exclusive to ourselves. With our own crest on the button, buttons are copied. Servants sell off old livery. It turns up at every fair in Norfolk." Josiah's voice had gone, Marianne noticed, very slightly too smooth, an over-explained smoothness. The smoothness of a man who has prepared an answer rather than discovered one in the moment it was needed. "You've grown very interested in old livery buttons all of a sudden, Sebastian. I wonder what's put the thought in your head." Josiah's eyes moved, briefly but unmistakably, to Marianne where she stood by the window, and something in his expression sharpened. "Or rather, I wonder who has." "Don't," Sebastian said, in a voice that had gone very quiet and very cold. "Whatever quarrel you have with what my wife has discovered, you will address it to me, not to her. And you will do it now, in this room, rather than on a dark road with 2 hired men and a set of fists. I've hired no one, and struck no one, and I resent the implication that a man of my standing would stoop to my standing." Sebastian's voice cut across his uncle's with a precision Marianne had not heard from him before, sharp and exact as a blade drawn from its sheath. "You've spent 10 years reminding me of standing, uncle. My standing, my father's standing, the family's standing, always as though standing were the one thing in this world worth protecting at any cost to anyone beneath it. I begin to wonder whether you ever once, in all that time, considered that a man's standing might be worth rather less than his conscience, or whether the thought has simply never once occurred to you as a possibility worth entertaining." "What precisely are you accusing me of?" "I haven't accused you of anything," Sebastian said. "I've told you what a milk boy saw, and I've asked you where you were on Tuesday last." "In Norwich, as you well know, since it was you who sent for me from there." "Norwich is 4 hours from Blakeney by a fast horse, uncle. I've made the ride myself." It was, Marianne thought, watching from the window, the first time she had seen Sebastian's careful public register crack entirely, not into anger, which she might have expected, but into something colder and more precise. The manner of a man cross-examining a witness rather than confronting a relative. Josiah seemed to feel the change, too. He crossed to the window seat and sat, rather more heavily than the conversation alone seemed to warrant, and for a moment the composure he had worn since the wedding breakfast slipped far enough that Marianne saw, underneath it, something she had not expected to find there. Not cruelty, exactly, in that unguarded instant, but a raw, cornered exhaustion. The look of a man who had been running a very long way from something for a very long time and had just felt it catch up to his heels. "You don't understand what's at stake," Josiah said, and then, visibly, caught himself and stood again. And by the time he had crossed back to the door, his voice had recovered its old, smooth confidence entirely. "I have nothing further to say on the matter of a milk boy's fancy. If you mean to accuse your own uncle of assaulting a boy on a public road, Sebastian, I should think very carefully about what evidence you imagine you actually possess before you say so to anyone beyond this room." He left without waiting to be dismissed. Marianne heard his coach in the forecourt within the half hour, considerably sooner than the visit's stated purpose ought to have permitted. "You don't understand what's at stake," Sebastian repeated, once the sound of the coach had faded. Turned the phrase over, as though it were a coin he meant to check for false weight. "That's not the sentence of an innocent man defending his character, Marianne. That's the sentence of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't want anyone else looking over his shoulder while he does it." He was right, and it took them the better part of the following week, working now openly together at the same desk rather than in separate rooms with separate secrets, to begin to understand what the arithmetic actually was. Sebastian wrote, with a directness his uncle had never permitted him to exercise over the trust accounts before, to the bank in the city that held the estate's principal funds, and learned, in a reply that took a fortnight to arrive and left him white about the mouth for the better part of an evening after he read it, that Josiah had, over the preceding year, drawn against his own private holdings separate from the estate trust, but heavily reliant on the same bank's confidence in his name to invest substantially in two of the Spanish-American mining ventures that had been sliding quietly, and then not so quietly, through the whole of that unsettled summer and autumn. The bank's letter used the word considerable twice in reference to the sums involved, and the word concerning once, in reference to the bank's own position, and did not trouble to disguise, beneath its careful language, that Mr. Josiah Fanshawe stood to lose a very great deal of money indeed, if the ventures did not recover their value before the year was out, and that he had in recent months made more than one inquiry about the possibility of raising funds against the value of certain coastal lands recently brought into the family through marriage. The bank's letter arrived on the 11th of November, by which time the financial columns Marianne had once tracked alone at Ashcombe Park had become, even to readers with no direct interest in the matter, difficult to ignore. Two of the mining companies Josiah had invested in the Anglo-Mexican Association, and a smaller, more speculative venture trading under the name of the Real Del Monte Company had seen their share prices fall by more than half since midsummer, and a third, in which he held a smaller but still substantial interest, had ceased paying any dividend at all, pending what its directors described, in a notice Sebastian found reprinted in the Times, as a period of necessary reassessment. Country banks that had lent freely against such shares through the boom years of 1824 were beginning, by November, to call in what they could while any value at all remained to be called in against. And the letter from the city made plain that Josiah's own creditors, whoever they were, had begun to do precisely the same. "He needs the clay land," Marianne said, reading the letter over Sebastian's shoulder, understanding at last the true shape of the drainage surveys, the urgency, the whole hurried architecture of a marriage that had never, in fact, been about her father's old disgrace at all, except as a convenient story to tell the world while the real transaction proceeded underneath it. Not for the estate, for himself, to cover his own losses before whoever he owes discovers how badly he's already lost them. And Theo found Otway, Sebastian said slowly, which means Otway can put my father's name, and my uncle's, to the old business directly, not through a ledger anyone might argue was ambiguous, but through a living man's testimony in an actual court. If that testimony reaches a magistrate before my uncle has secured the land he needs, he loses everything twice over, the money, and whatever protection my father's death and 10 years of silence have bought him since. He looked at her, and for the first time since the wedding, Marianne saw in his face something that was not caution, or duty, or the careful management of an arrangement made by other people, but a plain, uncomplicated anger, entirely his own. He very nearly killed your brother to buy himself a little more time, Marianne. I don't intend to give him any more of it. She wrote to her father that same night, though she chose her words with considerably more care than she had used with Mr. Coombs, or even by now, with Sebastian himself. Her father had asked her, in the vestry on her wedding day, not to do anything reckless with whatever Theo brought her, and she had promised him nothing, because she had known even then that recklessness might prove unavoidable. She did not tell him, in this letter, the full particulars of the ledger. She told him only that the truth of 1,815 had been found, that it vindicated him entirely, that it would soon be made right in whatever public form the law allowed, and that she loved him, and that whatever came next, he was not to fear for her safety, because she was no longer carrying any of it alone. I have found, Papa, she wrote, near the letter's close, a husband rather better than the arrangement that produced him deserved. I do not know yet what to call what has grown between us these last months, whether it deserves so grand a word as love, or only the smaller, steadier word of partnership. But I know that I no longer stand in that muniment room, or anywhere else in this house, entirely alone. And I did not think in June that I would ever be able to write you such a sentence and mean it. She sealed the letter and sent it by the morning post, and sat afterward a long while at the small writing desk with the candle burning low, thinking of her father reading it at Salthouse Hall, his, she imagined, no longer quite so thin and papery as they had been at the wedding, steadied now by 10 weeks of knowing that his daughter had not, after all, forgotten what he'd asked of her in that narrow vestry space, even as she had gone on, quietly and deliberately, to do precisely the reckless thing he'd feared. The letter was not in the muniment room at all, but in Josiah's own study at Ashcombe House in London, a room Sebastian had rarely entered without his uncle present, and which he broke into, in the end, quite literally, prizing a small locked drawer in the desk, with a chisel borrowed from the stables at midnight, 3 days after the interview in the estate office, while Josiah was reported by his own London servants to be dining at his club and unlikely to return before 2. The lock gave more easily than he expected, with a single sharp crack that seemed, in the dead silence of a sleeping house, loud enough to wake every servant on the floor above, though no one came. And Sebastian sat for a full minute afterward, with the chisel still in his hand and his heart going hard enough that he could feel it in his own throat, before he trusted himself to set the tool down and begin, carefully, methodically, the business of a man searching his own family's history for a truth he had spent 3 years, not quite letting himself want to find. They had come to London together, he and Marianne, on the pretext of consulting the family's own solicitor about the trust accounts, a pretext that had the useful additional virtue of being entirely true, since a letter had gone that same week to Mr. Coombs in Norwich, and a second, more delicate one to a barrister of Sebastian's acquaintance who specialized, as it happened, in the law of trusts and the considerably murkier law of what a trustee might be made to answer for when the funds he was meant to protect proved instead to have protected only himself. Sebastian had reasoned, in the days since the confrontation in the estate office, that whatever else his uncle had hidden over the years, he would not have trusted the whole of it to a Norfolk muniment room that a determined daughter-in-law had already proven capable of penetrating. A man who had spent a decade guarding secrets learned early to keep his most dangerous papers close to hand, in a study he controlled absolutely, in a city where a locked drawer could be trusted to stay locked without a housekeeper's divided loyalties to worry about. The reasoning had proved sound within a quarter hour of his beginning the search, though what it yielded was nothing at all like what he had expected to find. The drawer held, along with a quantity of unremarkable correspondence concerning the mining ventures whose value Sebastian now understood a great deal better than he wished to, a single sealed letter in his father's hand, addressed not to Edmund Selwyn but to Mr. Aldous Prynne, the family's own solicitor of many years' standing, and dated the 3rd of December, 1821, some 10 weeks before Marcus Fanshau's death. The seal had already been broken, and inexpertly resealed with a plainer wax that did not match the original, a detail Sebastian noticed with the cold precision of a man cataloging evidence rather than feeling grief, because grief, he was beginning to understand, was a luxury he had not yet earned the right to afford. Prynne, the letter began. Without the usual courtesies his father generally observed, even with servants of 30 years' standing, I find I can no longer sleep in this house with what I know sitting under its own roof unspoken, and I am too old and too tired to go on pretending otherwise to myself, whatever I have managed to pretend to everyone else these 10 years. You drew up at my instruction the paper by which Sir Edmund Selwyn accepted responsibility for an irregularity in the clay drainage fund. You know, because I told you at the time, and you were good enough not to ask further, that the irregularity was not entirely as described. I mean to set it right before I die, whatever that costs this family in the world's opinion, because I have discovered, at considerably greater cost to my own conscience than the world's opinion has ever managed to charge me, that a man cannot go on drawing interest forever on another man's silence without eventually finding the debt called in against his own soul rather than his purse. I should like you to draw up a second paper, restoring Selwyn's name in whatever form the law allows, and I should like it done before the new year. I have not told my brother of this intention. I do not expect he will receive it well. The letter was unfinished, cut off mid-sentence, the pen lifted and never set down again, whether from interruption or exhaustion or some failure of nerve Sebastian would now never be able to ask his father about. Beneath it, in the cramped, hurried hand Marianne had already taught him to recognize from the ledger's second correspondent, someone had written, small and close to the letter's torn edge, a note that had plainly never been meant for any eye but the writer's own, found this before Prynne ever saw it, thank God, and will not be told it went astray. Matter closed, and had better stay closed, for all our sakes his most of all, given the state of his heart these past months. Sebastian read the note 3 times before its full weight settled on him. His father had died of a seizure of the heart, in his sleep, in the last week of February 1822, a death the family physician had pronounced entirely natural, a death Sebastian himself, 25 years old and grieving in the ordinary, uncomplicated way a son grieves a father he loved without ever having fully known, had never once thought to question. He did not think, reading his uncle's note now, that he had grounds to question it in any way a court would credit, There was no poison here, no confession of violence. Nothing but a single cold reference to the state of his heart these past months, which might mean nothing at all beyond a nephew's private unkind observation of an old man's failing constitution. But he understood, reading it, that his uncle had known for the whole of the 10 weeks between the letter's writing and his father's death, that Marcus Fanshawe intended to unmake everything Josiah had spent a decade building and protecting, and had said nothing and done nothing that any physician could name, and had simply let the old man's heart fail under a weight of guilt and thwarted intention that Josiah himself, by intercepting the letter, had ensured could never be lifted in time. He sat for a long while in his father's own chair, in his uncle's stolen study, with the unfinished confession in his hands, and found that what he felt was not, primarily, anger at his uncle, though there was anger enough in it. What he felt mostly was a kind of grief he had not been permitted to feel 3 years before, because he had not then known there was anything to grieve beyond the ordinary fact of a father's death grief for a man who had tried, in the end, however late and however imperfectly, to do the right thing, and had been robbed even of the chance to see it through. He tried, he said aloud, to the empty room, and found his own voice unsteady in a way it had not been since he was a boy. He tried, and Josiah stopped him, and let him die still believing he'd failed at even that. He found Marianne still awake in the small sitting room they had taken at Ashcombe House for this brief London visit, reading by a single candle with the determined stillness of a woman waiting up for news she suspected would not be good. He said nothing when he entered. He only crossed the room and put his father's unfinished letter into her hands, and sat beside her while she read it. And when she had finished, she did not offer him the easy comfort of a platitude, which he found afterward he was grateful for beyond any measure he could easily have explained. He was trying to give it back, she said quietly. Your father, at the very end. Too late to matter to your father's 10 years, and too late, it seems, to matter to his own life either. Sebastian's voice was rough in a way he had not permitted it to be in front of her before. I don't know what to do with that, Marianne. I've spent 3 years grieving a man I thought I understood, and I find tonight that I never understood him at all, that he was worse than I knew, and better than I knew, both at once. And I can't seem to hold the two of those together in my chest without one or the other of them slipping. You don't have to hold them together tonight, she said, and took his hand, the gesture entirely unstudied, entirely unlike the careful courtesies they had exchanged across dinner tables for 4 months. Grief isn't required to make sense the same evening it arrives. Sometimes it takes rather longer than that. They sat together a long while in the candlelight, his father's confession folded on the table between them, and neither of them spoke again of what it meant, because there was nothing further, just then, that either of them could usefully say. Josiah did not return to his club that night, nor to Ashcombe House at all. A porter roused Sebastian shortly before 3 in the morning with word that Mr. Fanshawe's own coachman had come round to the Mews an hour before in evident haste, and taken the light traveling carriage and a fresh pair of horses north out of London on the Norwich road, alone but for the coachman himself, with no baggage beyond a single locked case the coachman had been told, in terms that brooked no questions, to guard with his life. Sebastian understood, within the space of the minute it took the porter to finish speaking, exactly where his uncle was going and exactly why. Josiah knew now from the interview in the estate office, from whatever instinct for danger a decade of careful concealment sharpens in a man, that the ledger and the letters were found, that Theo Selwyn had survived to point a milk boy's description at a family crest, and that a Norfolk boat builder named Silas Otway remained, above all other threats, the one witness who could stand up in an actual court of law and say, in his own voice, what he had once carried, and for whom. A ledger could be argued over. A living man's testimony, given under oath, could not. They left within the hour, Sebastian and Marianne together in the faster of the two remaining carriages, with a groom sent ahead on the swiftest horse in the stable to carry warning to the Blakeney magistrate, and, if he could be found in time, to Silas Otway himself. They reached Ashcombe Park a little after dawn the following day, having changed horses twice and slept not at all, and pressed on within the hour toward the coast, because the groom sent ahead had not yet returned, and because neither of them any longer trusted a letter, however fast the rider, to arrive in time. The last 3 miles they covered on horseback, along a coast track too narrow and too broken by tidal creeks for any carriage, in a thin, cold October fog that had rolled in off the sea sometime in the night and showed no sign yet of lifting. The marsh at that hour was a strange, muffled country, all its ordinary landmarks the sea wall, the distant lights of Clay Village, the black shapes of the fishing boats drawn up above the tide-line, reduced to vague suggestions, half glimpsed and then swallowed again, so that Marianne found herself navigating as much by the sound of the tide, somewhere off to her right as by anything her eyes could actually confirm. Marianne rode astride, in a borrowed pair of Sebastian's own breeches beneath her cloak, a fact neither of them found time to remark on, though it would occur to her much later, as one of the stranger details of the entire night, that she had crossed the last miles to whatever waited at Clay dressed, for the first time in her life, as something other than a lady. She thought, riding through the fog with her husband's shape, a dark blur just ahead of her, of every version of herself the last 5 months, had required her to become the composed bride at St. George's, the patient wife arranging her few belongings around the edges of a room not yet her own, the methodical researcher copying ledger entries by candlelight, and now this, a woman in borrowed breeches, riding hard through a Norfolk marsh at 3 in the morning toward a boat shed where a man she had married for reasons that had nothing to do with love might within the hour be shot dead trying to save an old sailor's life. Her mother's letter had spoken of a woman who decided before crossing a threshold that she would love whatever waited inside it. Marianne had not made that decision consciously. In June, riding north in a coach that smelled of lavender and old leather, she understood, riding through the fog toward Clay, that some quieter, more stubborn part of her had made it anyway, somewhere in the months since, without troubling to ask her conscious permission first. They found Otway's boat shed by the light in its single window, burning at an hour when an honest boat builder would long since have been asleep, and by the sound, carrying strangely across the flat, fog-muffled marsh, of a man's voice raised in something close to pleading. Sebastian left the horses tied 100 yards off. At Marianne's own insistence, she had learned, in 4 months of marriage, conducted mostly at a careful distance, that her husband's instinct in a crisis ran toward the direct and the immediate, and that this instinct, however admirable, would get them heard on the marsh long before it got them anywhere useful. They went the last stretch on foot, along a path Otway himself had worn into the reeds over years of night work Marianne did not need explained to her now, and came at last to a gap in the shed's plank wall wide enough to see through without being seen. Josiah stood inside, in the same green traveling coat, a pistol in one hand and the leather ledger, the original or its twin. Marianne could not tell which, from the gap in the boards in the other, held out over a small iron brazier that had plainly been built up for exactly this purpose. Silas Otway stood pressed against the far wall, an old man, smaller and grayer than Marianne had pictured him from Theo's letter, with both hands raised, palms out, in the universal gesture of a man asking for nothing more than another minute to live. He was, Marianne understood even in the chaos of the moment, exactly the sort of man the ledger's later pages had described, without ever quite naming as a person one of the many small, useful lives a decade of prize money fraud and smuggled brandy had bent quietly to its purposes. A boat builder who had likely wanted nothing more, at 17 or 18, than honest work on an honest coast, and had found himself instead bound by fear and small regular payments into a silence he had carried for longer than Marianne herself had been alive. "I never said your name to the boy," Otway was saying, in a voice worn thin with fear rather than age. "I never said it to no one. Not in 10 years. You know that. You've had my silence bought and paid for since before that boy of yours could walk. 10 years I've kept faith with you and your brother both," Otway said, his voice cracking now with something closer to anger than fear. 10 years of watching my own boy grow up thinking his father was nothing more than a builder of small boats, when I could have told him things about this coast that would have curled his hair, and I held my tongue for it, every single year, because you and your brother between you made very sure I understood what silence was worth to a man with a family of his own to protect. And now you'd burn me for it anyway, the moment it suits you better than paying me does. It was never about what suited me. It was always about what suited you. Every last penny of it since before that boy of mine was born." Otway's raised hands were shaking now, though, whether with fear or fury Marianne could no longer entirely tell. "You Fanshaws never once, in 10 years, asked what any of it cost the men who did the actual carrying. Only ever what it cost yourselves to keep it quiet. You said enough," Josiah said. Marianne noted, even through the terror of the moment, had lost entirely the smooth, practiced control it had worn in the estate office 3 weeks before. What remained was something rawer and considerably more dangerous. The voice of a man who had run out of every option except the one currently in his hand. "You said enough to a boy who's already halfway to a magistrate with it, and I am not going to hang for a war that ended 10 years ago and a brother who's been dead 3. Do you understand me? I am not." Sebastian moved before Marianne could stop him, shouldering through the gap in the plank wall with a force that tore the rotten boards half off their nails, and Josiah spun toward the sound with the pistol already rising, and for one long, suspended second that Marianne would remember for the rest of her life as having lasted considerably longer than any single second reasonably could, the barrel of the gun swung past Otway, past the brazier, and settled, trembling very slightly on his own nephew's chest. Uncle Sebastian did not move again. His voice, when it came, was very quiet and very level, the same careful register he had used at the altar 4 months before, though Marianne understood now, watching him, that the levelness cost him a great deal more this time than it had then. "Put it down. It's finished. Whatever you burn in that fire tonight," Otway's already told a magistrate's clerk in Blakeney everything he knows, 3 hours ago, under my own instruction. "There is nothing left in that ledger you can protect by killing anyone in this shed." It was not strictly true the groom sent ahead had not yet returned, and Otway had told no one anything at all beyond what Josiah had already heard through the plank wall. But Marianne saw it land, saw something in her husband's uncle's face crumple inward around the lie, the way a bad debt finally crumples a man who has spent years pretending he could outrun it, and in the half-second of hesitation that followed, she stepped through the broken gap in the wall herself, directly into the space between the pistol and her husband, because she had understood, watching from outside, that a man capable of hanging on to a gun for one more second was not a man who could be talked down by reason alone, and that he had never, not once in 4 months, expected her to do anything but stand quietly to one side and let the men in her life decide what became of her. "You told me once," she said to Josiah, in the same low, unhurried voice she had used at her own wedding, "that I agreed to a great deal." "I did. I agreed to marry a family I did not choose, to carry a debt I did not owe, to keep silent about a wrong I did not commit. I am done agreeing to things that cost me everything and cost you nothing at all. Put the pistol down, Mr. Fanshawe. Whatever happens to you after tonight, it does not need to include this." Whether it was her words, or the sound of hooves and raised voices now unmistakably approaching along the coast, tracked the Blakeney Coast Guard detachment, out on its ordinary night patrol of a shore still worked, 10 years on, by considerably smaller and more honest smugglers than the Fanshawe brothers had once been. Drawn to the light and the shouting the way any patrol would be, Marianne never afterward could say for certain. But Josiah's hand, holding the pistol level on his nephew's chest, began to shake, and then to lower. And by the time the first Coast Guard officer ducked through the broken gap in the boat shed wall, pistol drawn and lantern raised, Josiah Fanshawe was on his knees on the packed earth floor, the ledger fallen unburnt beside the brazier, weeping in the ugly, unguarded way of a man who has run out of every road except the one leading directly to the thing he spent a decade trying to outrun. The Coast Guard officer, a weathered lieutenant named Halsey, who had patrolled that stretch of coast for 11 years and had, Marianne would learn later, a long professional memory for exactly the kind of night traffic the ledger described, took Josiah into custody on the spot for the immediate matter of the pistol and the plain evidence of an assault in progress, and sent, within the hour, for the county magistrate to take formal charge of a matter that would, everyone in the shed already understood, be laid before the Norfolk Assizes as something considerably graver than a single night's violence. Sebastian did not go to his uncle. He crossed instead to where Otway still stood shaking against the far wall, and to Marianne, and put one arm around each of them, and stood for a long moment in the cold, ledger-lit dark of the boat shed, saying nothing at all, while outside the fog began at last, very slowly, to lift off the marsh. Lieutenant Halsey found Marianne a little while later, standing apart from the others near the shed's broken wall, and touched his hat to her with the careful respect of a man who had plainly heard, somewhere in the confusion of the last quarter hour, rather more about the night's true business than the official report he would eventually file would ever record. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but I've patrolled this stretch of coast the better part of 11 years, and I've never once seen a lady stand her ground in front of a leveled pistol the way you did tonight. Whatever comes of the rest of it, at the assizes and after, I thought you ought to know that." He touched his hat again and moved off to see to the prisoner, leaving Marianne alone for a moment with a strange, delayed trembling that had not come to her at all during the confrontation itself, and arrived now, all at once, in the safe and ordinary aftermath, exactly as she supposed it always did. She found Sebastian a few minutes later, standing apart near the horses with his uncle's ledger held loosely in one hand, looking down at it with an expression she could not entirely read, not quite grief, not quite relief, but some exhausted mixture of both that she suspected she would come to know rather well in the weeks ahead, as the full reckoning of what his own family had done settled properly into a man who had spent 3 years believing himself the inheritor of nothing more complicated than an ordinary debt-encumbered estate. "It's over," he said, when she reached him, though his voice carried more uncertainty in it than the words themselves allowed for. "Or it will be, once the assizes have done their work. I keep waiting to feel as though it's over, and I find I mostly feel tired and rather sad. in ways I hadn't expected sadness to attach itself to a night that ended with my uncle in custody rather than in a grave. It's allowed to be both, Marianne said. Relief and grief together. I don't think either one cancels the other out, whatever we're taught to expect. He looked at her for a long moment in the thinning fog, and something in his face settled, the way a held breath finally settles into an ordinary one. No, he said. I don't suppose it does. They rode back to Ashcombe Park together in the gray light of a Norfolk dawn, the ledger wrapped now in Sebastian's own coat against the last of the damp, and said very little else to each other on the way, because there are some nights, Marianne was beginning to understand, that leave a person with nothing further to say until they have had a little time to simply be finished having survived them. They did not speak of it properly until they were home again. Past midnight the following night, in the garden at Ashcombe Park, where a hard early frost had already silvered the last of the year's roses and turned the gravel paths pale and crunching underfoot, Marianne had walked out alone first, unable to sit any longer in a house full of magistrates' letters and her husband's careful, exhausted silences. And Sebastian found her there some 20 minutes later, sitting on the stone bench beneath the old yew at the garden's end, wrapped in a cloak too thin for the cold and plainly not minding it. At the altar, he said, coming to stand before her rather than sitting beside her, as though some instinct told him she needed the space to say what she had come out here to say. I told you that you would beg for my favor. Yes. And you told me you never had in your whole life and never would. I remember. I find I owe you rather more than an apology for that, Marianne, though I mean to offer the apology as well, in whatever form you'll accept it. I should like to know, properly, plainly, what you want from this family, now that the worst of it is out in the open at last. Not what you'll settle for, what you actually want. She had been preparing the answer, in one form or another, since the muniment room in September, and she found, now that the moment had finally arrived, that it came to her whole and steady, without any of the hesitation she had half expected of herself. I want my father's name restored, she said, in the Gazette, in your own hand, within the month. Not a vague notice about an irregularity resolved. The truth, as far as the law allows it to be printed, that he was wronged, not wrongdoing, and that the wrong was done to him by this family. Done. I want your uncle answered, for at the assizes, for everything the law can be made to reach the assault on my brother, and whatever the barrister and Mr. Coombs between them can prove of the rest. I do not want him quietly pensioned off to some small house to live out his days in comfortable disgrace. I want him tried. Done. I've already written to the barrister this morning. There'll be no quiet arrangement made on his behalf, whatever it costs the family name to see it through properly. And I want my brother brought here, to Ashcombe Park, to be cared for by your own physician at your own expense, for as long as his recovery takes, and longer after that if he wishes to stay. Done, and gladly. I should like to know him properly in any case. I understand he takes rather more after your mother than your father, and I find I've grown curious about the sort of man that produces. And I want Silas Otway protected, she added, from whatever this county's opinion makes of a man who spent 10 years running contraband, whatever the law technically permits it to do to him, now that his part in it is known. He was as much a victim of your father's arrangement as mine was, in his own smaller way, and I will not have him made to answer alone for sins that began at Ashcombe Park and merely ended, 20 years later, in his boat shed. I've already written to the customs authority at Yarmouth, Sebastian said, requesting that whatever leniency the law allows be extended to a man who has, by every account reaching me, done nothing these 10 years but keep silent under duress, and finally, at considerable personal risk, chosen to speak. I can't promise you the law will listen, I can promise you, I'll make the argument as forcefully as a peer of the realm is able to make it. That will have to be enough, for now." She looked at him for a long moment in the cold moonlight, and found that the fourth thing she had come out here to say, the thing she had not, in fact, fully admitted to herself until this exact moment, sitting on a frost-silvered bench, with her husband standing before her, having said done 3 times running, without once asking what it would cost him, required rather more courage than the first 3 combined. "I did not marry you for revenge," she said. "I want that understood plainly, whatever this last month has looked like from the outside. I married you because a marriage gave me access to a room I could never otherwise have entered, and because I had a brother in danger and a father in disgrace, and very few honest tools left to help either of them with. The revenge, if that's even the right word for wanting the truth told plainly after 10 years of lies, was never the point. The truth was the point. I understand that. I do not yet know what I want from you," she went on, "beyond what I've already asked. I do not know you well, Lord Ashcombe, 4 months and 1 night in a boat shed notwithstanding. I know that you stood between a loaded pistol and an old man you'd never met, for no better reason than that it was the right thing to do. I know that you searched your own uncle's desk in the dark, rather than let a lie about your father stand unchallenged. I think I could, in time, come to know you rather better than that, if you were willing to be known. But I will not ask for that either. I have done all the asking I intend to do tonight." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her in the cold, steady way she had come to recognize over these last weeks, not as suspicion any longer, but as something closer to attention, the particular, careful attention of a man who has finally understood that the woman in front of him is worth the trouble of actually seeing. "Then I'll do what asking needs doing from here," he said, "and you may simply tell me, whenever you're ready, whether the answer is yes." Marianne sat with that unfinished question a long while after he had gone quiet beside her, turning it over the way she had once turned over the 8 clean pages of the drainage account, looking for the seam where the tidy version and the true one diverged. She found, this time, no seam at all, only a man beside her on a cold stone bench who had asked for nothing in return for everything he had just promised, and who seemed, for the moment at least, entirely content to wait for an answer she had not yet fully found the courage to give even to herself. He did not ask that night what the question would eventually be. He sat instead beside her on the cold stone bench, close enough that their shoulders touched, and neither of them said anything further at all, while the frost went on silvering the last of the roses, and the tide, somewhere beyond the beech wood, turned quietly toward morning. By the 2nd week of December, the newspapers Marianne had once read alone at Ashcombe Park, for want of better company, were being read, with considerably greater anxiety, in every counting-house and drawing-room in London. 6 banking houses in the city had suspended payment within a single fortnight. Word had reached Norwich, by the week's end, that 2 of the smaller country banks that served half the market towns of East Anglia had done the same, and a general, half-panicked scramble for gold had set in that made the failure of Josiah Fanshaw's private speculations look, to those who understood the scale of what was actually unfolding, like a single drop in a flood already well underway. The Bank of England itself, it was said in every coffee-house and club in the city, had come within a hair of suspending payment altogether in the 2nd week of the month, saved only by the fortunate, almost accidental discovery of a forgotten box of old £1 notes in its own vaults, printed years before and never destroyed, which had been rushed into circulation to steady a public confidence that gold alone could no longer supply quickly enough. Sebastian, reading the account in his club with a considerably more personal interest than he would have brought to it 4 months before, understood for the first time the full, unglamorous truth of what his uncle's desperation had actually been racing against all autumn. Not a single bad investment, easily absorbed by a comfortable fortune, but the leading edge of a crisis large enough to swallow banks that had stood, in the public's estimation, since before either of their grandfathers were born. The season itself, thin as it already was in December, took on a strange, brittle quality that winter dinners still held, cards still played, but with a nervous undertone running beneath every ordinary courtesy, as hostesses who had, a year before, competed for the most fashionable guest list now found themselves competing instead to seem least affected by whichever bank held their husbands' fortunes. Lady Jersey herself was said to have quietly withdrawn a standing invitation from a gentleman whose bank had suspended payment that very week, a small, telling cruelty that struck Sebastian, hearing of it secondhand, as considerably more honest about the true workings of society than anything Denbrook had ever told him about the value of an unblemished name. Sebastian had come to London to see the Norfolk Assizes papers properly filed with the barrister, and to arrange, at Marianne's own particular request, for the Gazette notice to be set for the last week of the year, when the news might carry furthest into a season already thin on other subjects worth discussing. He had not expected, arrive at his club on the second afternoon, to find a note from Lord Denbrook waiting for him with an urgency that admitted no delay. He found the Marquis in his own library on Grosvenor Square an hour later, standing rather than seated, a decanter untouched on the table, between them a bad sign. Sebastian had learned over 3 years of the man's patronage, since Denbrook reached for wine only when a conversation was going comfortably, and left it alone entirely when he had something difficult to manage. "I've had a most extraordinary letter," Denbrook said, without preamble, "from a barrister of your acquaintance, requesting certain papers of mine touching the character of your uncle, in connection with a matter to be laid before the Norfolk Assizes. I confess I had to read it twice before I understood what I was being asked to lend my name to. Then you understand the matter correctly. My uncle assaulted my wife's brother twice, and attempted a third assault with a pistol on a witness at Clee, in an effort to conceal a fraud my own father committed 10 years ago against Sir Edmund Selwyn. I intend to see the whole of it tried properly, and my father's part in it acknowledged publicly in the Gazette before the year is out." Denbrook was silent for a long moment, his face working through several expressions Sebastian had never before seen him wear in 3 years of careful, avuncular good humor. "You understand what this does to the lieutenancy," he said finally. "The Duke will not put your name forward, will not, I think, be able to put your name forward, whatever his own private sympathies for a man whose own father stands publicly accused of forgery, fraud, and conspiracy to conceal a hanging offense. It is not a question of anyone's fairness to you personally, Ashcombe. It is a question of what the office itself requires, a name the county can trust without a single asterisk beside it. You will have handed that away, publicly and permanently, the moment this notice runs. I understand that. Do you? I am not sure you do, quite yet, because you have not yet lived a single day as the man who might have had it and gave it up instead. I have spent 3 years building the case for your name with the Duke, Sebastian. 3 years, and a great deal of my own credit besides, spent on the understanding that I was building it for a man who understood the value of what was being built. I am asking you, as plainly as I know how to ask anything, to let the Assizes matter proceed quietly, as such matters so often do among families of consequence, and let the Gazette notice wait indefinitely. if need be until the lieutenancy is settled and there is nothing left for anyone to lose by it. Sebastian stood for a long moment in the library's cold afternoon light, looking at the man who had been, for 3 years, the nearest thing to a father he had left in the world, and found that the choice, when it actually arrived, was very much simpler than he had spent the whole of the autumn fearing it would be. "I promised my wife the notice would run this month," he said. "I promised it before I understood what it might cost either of us, which I think is rather the only kind of promise worth making, at all the sort made before you know the full price and kept afterward regardless. I am sorry to lose the lieutenancy, my lord. I am considerably more sorry to have made you doubt, even for an afternoon, that I understood the value of what you'd built for me. But I did not marry a woman who promised, in a book I was never meant to read, that she would never beg anyone for anything, only to spend the whole of our marriage asking her to wait a little longer for the one thing she asked of me plainly and without flinching. The notice runs this month, my lord, whatever it costs either of us. I hope in time you'll understand why it had to." Denbrook did not answer him further that afternoon, and did not, in fact, answer him at all for the better part of a fortnight, a silence Sebastian understood, walking out of Grosvenor Square into a cold, gathering dusk, as very possibly the end of the nearest thing to a second father he had known since his own died, still trying, too late and too quietly, to do the very thing his son was now doing in the open. The fortnight's silence broke, in the end, with a short note rather than the summons Sebastian had half expected, delivered to his club on the same morning the Gazette notice was set to run. "Ashcombe," it read, in Denbrook's own hand, considerably less steady than its usual confident copperplate. "I have spent a fortnight angry with you, and a further several days angry with myself for the particular shape my anger took, which I am obliged on reflection to admit had rather more to do with my own vanity in the matter than with any genuine concern for your interests. I built the case for your lieutenancy because I believed you the sort of man the county could trust without reservation. I understand now that I meant by that a man who would trust me without reservation in turn, which is not at all the same virtue. However much I had allowed myself to confuse the two over 3 convenient years. You are, I think, exactly the sort of man I hoped you were when I first began building that case. I simply failed to anticipate that the proof of it would cost me the very thing I was building. I do not know that I can forgive myself the fortnight's sulk. I find I have no difficulty at all forgiving you the choice that caused it. D." Sebastian read the note twice. Standing in the club's front hall with the day's Gazette not yet printed, and his uncle's trial still months from its final reckoning at the assizes, and found that it was, in its own careful, aristocratic way, very nearly an apology, the first he realized that Denbrook had ever in 3 years of acquaintance troubled himself to offer anyone at all. The notice ran in the Gazette on the 22nd of December, 1825, a plain, unadorned paragraph stating that certain matters concerning the affairs of Sir Edmund Selwyn, Baronet, in the year 1815, had been reviewed by the present Earl of Ashcombe and found, upon examination of papers in the late Earl's own hand, to have been wrongly recorded, that Sir Edmund had been the victim of a fraud perpetrated by persons connected with the Ashcombe estate, and that his name was, so far as the present Earl's own acknowledgment could restore it, cleared of any imputation of wrongdoing whatsoever. It was signed in full Ashcombe. Sir Edmund Selwyn read it at his own breakfast table at Salthouse Hall on the morning of the 23rd, in a copy of the paper his daughter had sent ahead by express, rather than trust to the ordinary post, and read it. His housekeeper reported afterward with some alarm, 3 times through, in complete silence before he set it down. very carefully, beside his untouched tea, and asked, in a voice that did not entirely hold steady, to be left alone in the room for a little while. He sat there the better part of an hour, by all accounts, with the paper in his hands and the fire burning low, a man reading, at the very last, 10 years too late by any ordinary reckoning and precisely on time by every reckoning that actually mattered, his own name given back to him in a stranger's newspaper by the son of the man who had taken it away. Mary Ann rode to Salthouse herself 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, and found her father in the small parlor where he had taken all his meals alone since her mother's death, the Gazette still folded on the table beside his chair, though he had plainly read it a great many times since the 23rd. "You did this," he said, when she had settled beside him, not quite a question and not quite an accusation, but something that held elements of both. "You went looking, after everything I asked you not to do anything reckless with what Theo brought you, and you found it. And you did not stop until it was made right in front of the whole county." "I did. I am angry with you," he said, "and prouder of you than I have ever been of anything in my whole life. And I find both of those things sitting in my chest at once, without the smallest difficulty, which I did not expect." Going into this conversation, he took her hand, the way he had taken it in the vestry 6 months before, though his grip, she noticed, had grown steadier, since, whether from the season's better health or simply from the lifting of a weight he had carried it so long, he had stopped noticing its full burden until it was finally set down. "Your mother would have done exactly what you did, given the chance. I have known that about her and feared it a little for the whole of our marriage. I begin to think I ought to have feared it rather less and trusted it rather more. She did do it, Papa, in her own way and in her own time. I only finished what she started." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face since before her mother's death, something that was not quite the old grief, and not quite unclouded joy either, but a kind of settled, exhausted peace that seemed, watching it arrive, worth every risk the last 6 months had cost either of them. "Then I am glad," he said finally, "that I raised a daughter too stubborn to leave a locked room alone, whatever her father asked of her. Mr. Ezra Coombs came to Ashcombe Park himself in the first week of April, 1826. Rather than trust the matter to a letter, carrying a small rosewood box that Mary Ann recognized, the moment she saw it, as a twin to the workbox of her mother's she had brought with her from Salthouse the summer before, the same maker's mark on the lid, the same small brass lock, though this one, unlike her mother's, had never been broken. "Your mother came to me first in the autumn of 1815, Coombs said. Once he had been settled in the small sitting room with tea neither of them touched, some months after your father's affairs were, as the world believed, settled. She did not tell me then everything she suspected, only enough to ask that I make careful, discreet inquiries of my own into the clay drainage accounts, and into certain shipping records at the Custom House in Great Yarmouth over the years that followed. I did as she asked, a little at a time, whenever occasion allowed it, without drawing notice. She came to see the results herself, twice a year without fail, for as long as her health permitted it, and continued the correspondence by letter after she could no longer make the journey. She never told me," Mary Ann said, "not once, in all the years before she died. She left instructions on that point most particularly, my lady, which I am now at last at liberty to honor." Coombs opened the box and drew out a single sealed letter, addressed in a hand Mary Ann had not seen in nearly 4 years, and would have known instantly among 1,000 others. "She left this with me in the summer of 1822, some weeks before her final illness took its worst turn, along with a note directing that it should be given to you only once your father's name had been restored in some public and lasting form, a gazette notice, she specified, or its equivalent. Nothing less would satisfy the conditions she'd set. I confess I had begun to fear, these last 3.5 years, that the condition might never be met at all, and that I should be left holding this letter for the rest of my own natural life, with no honest way to deliver it. Marianne took the letter with hands that were, for the first time in the better part of a year, not entirely steady, and asked Mr. Coombs if he would forgive her reading it alone. She read it that evening in the garden, on the same stone bench beneath the yew where she and Sebastian had sat the night after Clay, with the first mild evening of the spring settling slowly over the beechwood, and the roses not yet budded, but no longer, at least, silvered with frost. My dearest girl, her mother had written, if Mr. Coombs has done as I asked, you are reading this only now, some years after I have gone, and only because your father's name has finally, properly, been given back to him. I did not tell you what I suspected while I lived, and I have thought a great deal, in the writing of this letter, about how to explain that choice to you without it sounding like the cowardice I sometimes feared, in my worst hours, that it actually was. I could have gone to a magistrate the year I first began to suspect the truth. I had by 1,818 enough gathered through Mr. Coombs's patient work to make a very great deal of trouble for the Fanshawe family, trouble I believed, and still believe, they had thoroughly earned. I did not do it, and I want you to understand why, because I think you are very like me in the particular stubbornness of your composure, and I think you may one day face a choice not unlike the one I faced, and I should like you to have my reasoning to weigh against your own, whatever you ultimately decide. Your father did not survive what was done to him in 1,815 whole. Marianne, whatever face he managed to show, you and your brother across the breakfast table all these years, a public trial, even a public trial that vindicated him entirely, even one that saw every Fanshawe in England answer for what they'd done, would have required him to stand up before the whole county and relive the worst month of his life in exhaustive, examined detail, with every particular of his own fear and humiliation laid open for strangers to weigh and judge. I did not believe, watching him across that same breakfast table for years afterward, that his heart could have borne it. I chose, therefore, to gather the truth and hold it in reserve rather than spend it while spending it might have cost me the very man I was gathering it to vindicate. This was not, I think now, entirely the right choice, nor entirely the wrong one. It was the choice available to a woman who loved her husband more than she loved the abstract satisfaction of justice delivered on the clock of her own choosing, and I have made my peace with it. Such peace as anyone makes with a decision that cost real years of real silence to a real, innocent man. I leave the rest to you, because you are stronger than I ever was, in the ways that matter for what remains to be done, and because I trust you to know, far better than I could from beyond the reach of any further news, when the right time has finally come. The right time is not when it is safest for you, my darling girl. It never is for women like us. It is when you have grown strong enough to carry what comes after the truth is told, not before, and never, whatever anyone tells you about virtue and patience, later than you actually can bear. I love you. I loved your father more than my own comfort, which is the only inheritance I have left to give you beyond the ordinary ones. And I believe, reading this now, in whatever version of yourself the years have made of you, that you have already proven yourself entirely capable of carrying it forward. All my love, always your mother. Marianne sat a long while in the gathering dark with the letter open on her lap, understanding at last the full shape of the thing she had spent a year believing herself alone in doing. She had thought herself the first and only architect of her family's justice, working in secret, because no one else had ever thought to work at all. She understood now that she had simply picked up a labor her mother had begun 11 years before her, carried as far as love and a dying woman's failing strength could carry it, and set down at last, deliberately, and with her own particular kind of courage, in trust that her daughter would one day be strong enough to finish it. She found Sebastian in the house an hour later, in the small sitting room where the fire had been kept up against the evening chill, and gave him, without a word of explanation, the letter she had carried against her heart since the morning of their wedding, Theo's letter, the one that had never reached her before the vows, delivered late by a brother who had nearly died bringing it, and read by her in full, only once, in the muniment room, on the same day she had found the ledger. Sebastian read it slowly, by the fire, while she watched, and when he had finished, he folded it again along its old, worn creases and handed it back to her without a word, because he had understood she saw exactly what she had needed him to understand, that the right thing to do with the most important paper in another person's life was to give it back to them whole, rather than to keep it, or to comment on it, or to make of it anything other than what it had always been hers, entirely, to carry or to set down as she chose. "Your mother was right," he said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough that she no longer expected him to break it, about the right time never being the safe time. "I think I have spent the whole of my own life waiting for the safe time to do a great many things I ought to have done considerably sooner, and I find I have very little patience left for that particular kind of waiting." "What are you asking me, Lord Ashcombe? I think you know." He came and sat beside her on the small settee, close enough that their shoulders touched, in the same easy, unhurried way they had sat together on the stone bench beneath the yew, months before, with a frost on the roses and a fortnight's worth of unspoken things still lying open between them. "I am asking whether the answer, now that the truth has been told and the year has been survived and your brother is laughing again in the room down the hall, is finally yes." Marianne looked at him a long moment, at the man who had stood between a loaded pistol and a stranger, for no reason but that it was right, who had searched his own dead father's stolen confession by chisel light rather than let a lie stand unchallenged, who had given up, without a single word of regret in 3 months since, the one office 3 years of careful patronage had built for him, because a promise made before he understood its cost was, he'd said, the only kind of promise worth keeping at all. Yes, she said, and saying it, that it cost her nothing at all, not because the word had grown cheap in the saying, but because she had finally, at the very last, found someone she did not have to spend it on begging. Down the hall, through the half-open door of the small parlor Theo had claimed as his own since his removal to Ashcombe Park in November, they could hear him laughing at something a private joke shared, Marianne suspected from the answering voice, with Mrs. Pargeter, who had taken to the recovering young man with a fondness that surprised no one in the household half so much as it surprised Mrs. Pargeter herself. His arm, the surgeon had pronounced only that week, would mend fully by summer, with nothing worse to show for the whole ordeal than a scar and a story he had already begun, with the shameless embellishment of a 19-year-old, given a genuinely dramatic tale to tell, to improve considerably in the retelling. Sebastian rose and drew Marianne up beside him, and together they walked down the hall toward the sound of her brother's laughter, not hurrying, not speaking further of the question she had just answered or the year it had taken them to arrive at asking it, but simply walking, in the unremarkable, companionable way of two people who had finally stopped, needing to prove anything to each other, toward a room full of ordinary evening warmth in a house that had very nearly cost them everything to make properly theirs. Outside, the last light was failing gently over the beechwood a Fanshawe had planted 130 years before to keep the world out, and the tide, somewhere beyond it, was turning once again toward morning, exactly as it had turned every evening since the first stone of Ashcombe Park was laid, indifferent to debts and forgeries, and ledgers and gallows, and all the small, fierce, human business of setting old wrongs right, and exactly as it would go on turning, Marianne thought, watching the light fade through the parlor window with her husband's hand steady in her own, long after every name in this particular story had been forgotten by everyone except the two people who had fought hardest to make sure it never would be.